The story begins in a dark hall at night. A broad-shouldered man in a blue military uniform and with a sword on his belt sits at a luxurious table with a line of servants behind him. The mysterious man clearly belonged to high society. His clothes were decorated with numerous jewels, but the man spoke in a voice as cold as an iceberg. He demanded that a certain Saint Dina be returned to him, and the people sitting opposite him in blue and yellow robes repeated this order in a slow, amazed tone. They might have been about to refuse outright, or at least come up with a lot of reasons for doing so, but before the people could even finish their sentences, the man in blue interrupted them and said that he didn't understand. In response, the eldest of the three, presumably the leader, indignantly rose to his feet and cried out, "Was it by any chance Archduke Devon who took the girl from the temple?" The old man in a rage continued his speech. He authoritatively declared that this low woman was a saint and therefore had to be at the temple, which made his interlocutor tense up slightly. The elderly man added that he was experiencing huge problems because of the actions of his interlocutor, but the latter was only worried about one thing, that his interlocutor dared to call Dina a low woman. However, the old man paid no attention to this subtle warning. Instead, he continued to rant about his own troubles and views. For example, now, he indignantly declared that a nearly awakened saint costs almost 1,000,000 errands, a completely exorbitant sum, and he did not care that we were talking about a living person and not a soulless things. In the end, the leader of the people in blue and yellow robes decided to make a gracious offer. The aristocrat returns Dina to him, and the old man pretends that nothing happened, but they could not finish the conversation. The man in blue, without changing his position in the chair, kicked the table, with such force that the unfortunate piece of furniture simply flew far to the side, as if it had been hit by an enraged giant. The frightened priests immediately grouped around their master Patrick. The latter was practically unharmed, but was terribly frightened and demanded an answer as to why the Grand Duke had acted in such a way in a holy place. The nobleman's response was as cold as Arctic waters, declaring that he would not tolerate such things any longer. Devon slowly drew the glittering blade from its sheath. The old cleric immediately began to sweat, because the tip of the blade stopped right in front of his flabby throat, clearly hinting that he shouldn't make any sudden movements. Only after this were the readers shown the face of the Archduke. He turned out to be a middle-aged man with bright green eyes and gray hair, and he stated that he was doing all this to save his daughter. The aristocrat was completely overcome with icy rage. He asked how the priests dared to speak to him in such a tone, and did they really believe that they would get away with this impudence? The soldiers behind Devon approached the terrified holy men, but Patrick desperately tried to remind them that attacking a priest was a terrible sacrilege, practically a declaration of war on God himself. The nobleman looked at this with incredible contempt. He felt nothing but disgust for this cowardly and hypocritical priest, but he still stopped and muttered through his teeth, "Okay." Slowly removing the sword from the old man's face, the gray-haired duke admitted that he had been wrong, and Patrick, unable to believe that he had gotten off so easily, began to praise the wisdom of the would-be assassin. As it turned out, a little prematurely, with just one movement so fast that the human eye could hardly follow it, the Grand Duke cut off the high-ranking priest's hand. The frightened, falsely smiling old man could not even understand for the first few seconds what had happened and where such a strange sensation in his upper limbs came from. But then it dawned on him, and the cleric screamed in incredible pain, while Devon, wiping blood from his sword, calmly replied that this was where the conversation should have started. While the younger priests fussed around their leader in horror, the nobleman ordered them to listen carefully. Esther should not be called that, but Dina, and also to remember that she was first and foremost his daughter, and not some kind of saint. If the temple's ministers ever allowed themselves to show such contempt for her again, the Archduke would declare a full-fledged war on them, and it was clear from his face that the man was not joking, and not even threatening, but promising. After this, the action moved to a completely different place and time. It was a beautiful sunny day. The sky was shimmering with a virgin blue, and the spires of the castle reached towards the snow-white clouds. It looked more like a fairy tale come to life than an ordinary building. Shining and surrounded by a beautiful garden, the castle looked very noble and original. Just then, a woman in a maid's uniform was running through the garden lifting her skirt. She was trying to find young Mrs. Esther and lure her home because it had already started to get cold outside. The mysterious protagonist turned out to be a little girl who had not yet entered adolescence. She looked cute and well-groomed, but in no way resembled a miracle worker overshadowed by a divine spirit. The only thing that distinguished the main character from an ordinary person was her huge pink-red eyes, and after looking at the servants with them, Esther agreed to return to the castle. After this, the action of the events moves to some kind of dungeon. It was very reminiscent of a stereotypical medieval dungeon with torture chambers. There were torches, scraps of iron targets, and other similar elements everywhere. For a moment, it seemed as if the place was completely dead and forgotten by the people from the outside world. But just a few seconds later, a suspicious sound was heard. These were quiet steps originating from two people wearing white and very expensive-looking shoes. Not at all suitable attire for walking in such places. They turned out to be two blonde men, a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing expensive knightly clothing, and a red-eyed woman with an expression on her face that was indifferent to everything that existed. This lady was very beautiful and could easily attract attention, even if she was dressed in beggarly rags. People who came across her path immediately bowed their heads, greeting Saint Raphael. A young priest in familiar yellow and blue robes came out to meet her and her companion. Bowing respectfully, the man noted that this was a great honor, since such an important person did not have to pray for her. Modestly folding her fragile, well-groomed hands on her chest, the girl admitted that perhaps they consider her special, but she is not able to give up prayers to higher powers. And besides, the child in question was simply dear to her heart. And the guide, hearing such an explanation, almost melted into a puddle from incredible emotion. Praising the fabulous kindness of Saint Raphael, the young priest led the guests past a dirty, sinister dungeon, in which fortunately there was nothing living. Eventually, they reached their destination, a room containing a young tortured girl with numerous scars on her skin and her hands bound with magical fetters. This was the main character whom the audience already knew as a little saint and the Duke's daughter. But now she was in the position of a victim, and those around her treated her like a monster. The blonde greeted the brunette in a good-natured tone and asked how she was doing here, but her companion did not allow the guide to interfere in the conversation. The young priest remained to watch what was happening from afar. He thought that Raphael was very kind, but judging by her look, the cleric mentally said this with poisonous sarcasm. Turning to the beaten girl hanging high above the ground, the woman began to complain about how hard things were for her. She had her mouth full of work, and her voice was quickly weakening. To cope with these troubles, she needs the protagonist's help. And at these words, the blonde cast a very telling glance at the bottle from which red sparks were flying. After this, the saint finally stopped pretending to be a good soul. Grimacing with disgust, she called her captive Dina a very bad girl. The Duke's unfortunate daughter could not answer this. Her mouth was very tightly and carefully tied, but her eyes, the same red-pink as Raphael's, opened in amazement. The antagonist, meanwhile, continued to scold the main character for the fact that last time she gave her less than before. For this, the woman decided to try to cut deeper. At that moment, the blonde knight quietly and very respectfully called out to the lady, and she asked with irritation what he wanted, because she wanted to continue the execution. Respectfully dropping to one knee, the man noted that it was not in the saint's interests to defile himself by touching such a creature, so he was going to perform the operation himself. Of course, if Raphael graciously allows it. And to ask permission, the young man looked straight into the lady's face, showing beautiful but dead fish-like eyes. In response, the blonde, figuratively speaking, shrugged her shoulders. From her point of view, it was a matter of nonsense, but she did not refuse her faithful Khalid in this regard. Dina, on the other hand, was having a hard time holding back her tears. Apparently, she knew this man in a past life, and now she could not understand how he could stoop to such depravity. Turning indifferently towards the door, the saint ordered her champion to perform the operation correctly. This time, she needed much more material than the previous one. Unlike his mistress, Khalid said nothing. He did not gloat or mock, but simply pulled out from the knives on his belt a huge blade that glowed in the underground darkness. Even a cursory glance was enough to understand that this was not an ordinary weapon at all. It seemed to be made of silver, and it was entwined with blooming roses, and the main character mentally added that this sword was blessed by heaven. Unfortunately, the current owner of the weapon treated it completely differently from how a true noble knight would have expected. The blond man mercilessly cut the defenseless girl's hand with the blade drawing blood. Whimpering softly, Dina thought that it was simply too painful and that she probably couldn't bear it anymore, while the man carefully collected the crimson liquid into an enchanted bottle. Rafian looked at it with a fixed, unblinking gaze, much the same expression you might find on a hungry snake that has finally laid eyes on a fat, helpless rat. The blood pouring into this vessel was dramatically transformed. It began to resemble some kind of harmless magic potion, and even its color became rich pink like floral oil. Having completed the terrible process, Khalid turned to the hostess, knelt down before her again, and with all possible respect, handed her the bottle as if making a sacrifice to a deity. The false saint smiled contentedly as she looked at this. With her whole appearance, the blonde demonstrated an unshakable confidence that there simply could not have been any other outcome. She took the vial of blood and just looked at it for a while. It was unknown what kind of magic was hidden in this small bottle, but it gave the contents a completely harmless appearance. But then Rafian closed her eyes, lowered her head, and very slowly, as if afraid to spoil the beauty of the moment, brought the vessel to her lips, preparing to drink the terrible liquid. This feigned action lasted for a few seconds, and then the blonde suddenly raised her head, and in a few deep gulps drained the bottle, leaving not even a drop. The woman seemed to be posing for invisible viewers, trying to demonstrate her beauty in the best light. But when she opened her eyes, they sparkled as if from tears. But naturally, she was not sad. On the contrary, Rafian felt an incredible surge of strength and vampire satisfaction from the fact that she had once again stolen someone else's power. The vile priestess did not hesitate to rub this fact in her victim's face. And Dina, unable to take revenge or even simply respond to the insult, looked at the blonde with inexpressible hatred. The antagonist sincerely stated that in this situation, it was she who had every moral right to sulk, and then asked the girl if she knew why the false saint continued to commit these abominations. The reason, in essence, was simple. The blonde believed that the protagonist had meanly and treacherously stolen what should have rightfully belonged to her Rafian. Gently stroking the brunette's chin and looking her straight in the eyes, the villainess announced in a gentle and affectionate tone that the main character's true crime was that she dared to be born at all. After that, the blonde lost her temper for a moment and hit the poor guy in the face, unable to even pretend to be friendly and generous towards her sworn enemy for the sake of a joke. In response, Dina only looked at the priestess with a gloomy, sorrowful gaze, and she continued to mock. If life is so hard and unfair, then why not pray to the goddess? The protagonist began to lose consciousness. It is unknown how long she sat in this dungeon and was beaten, but now her strength was rapidly leaving her. Because of this, the girl had a hard time understanding what Rafian was talking about, but it is quite possible that if she had been given the opportunity, the heroine would have bitten her throat out with her own teeth. The villainess didn't notice this. She continued to mock the victim, thinking out loud that only the goddess could possibly forgive the girl's sins, but eventually she got tired of it. Like many sadists, the blonde did not deny herself the pleasure of torturing her victim, even in the most insignificant details, and therefore, she finally declared that she would return, although this was already clear to everyone. After this nightmare, the audience is shown a magnificent emblem depicting a shining golden palace and two crossed swords. This is the symbol of the Great Austin Empire. This state is actually ruled by two people: an exclusively secular emperor, responsible for the life of his subjects, and a saint, a great spiritual leader. Religion plays a huge role for the inhabitants of this state, as in many ancient states of the earth. However, the people of Austin did not always consider themselves God's chosen people. Before the church was built and the empire recognized the power of the all-powerful and immortal goddess, this country was in unimaginable chaos and endless nightmare. These were not the usual dark ages, when the worst problems of people were hunger disease or wars among themselves. Then, man was nothing more than two-legged prey for various monsters. In those days, humanity was anything but the king of nature. Not a day passed without another settlement turning to ashes and the earth being stained with scarlet blood. People were dying regularly, in the thousands, without regard for social status, age, or gender. And at some point, it began to seem to them that there was no hope left at all, that their fate was nothing more than food. One day, a particularly terrible battle took place in a large city. The monsters, as usual, easily overcame the resistance of the defenders and began to slowly cut out people one after another. And at that moment, when it seemed that everything had finally gone to hell, a real miracle happened. A bright golden light descended from the crimson skies. Of course, this was not an ordinary natural phenomenon. It turned out to be a beautiful woman with glowing skin hair and eyes dressed in an ancient Greek tunic. One glance at the face of the deity was enough for people to immediately forget about their fears and grief. Those who remained alive fell to their knees praising the celestial being. It turned out to be Saint Espito, and her mere presence on the ravaged land was enough for humanity to gain a second wind, gathering a huge, fearless army. The years when people were helpless victims of monsters and demons were over. Now, blessed by divine blessing, they were ready to take revenge. Thanks to the messenger of higher powers, the era of death finally ended. People drove away, the monsters gradually restored the destroyed country, and entered an era of prosperity. To properly thank Espito, the new emperor ordered the construction of a magnificent temple in her honor, and people visited it daily by the thousands, tirelessly praising the Holy Virgin in their prayers. This beautiful and inspiring story created a very unpleasant contrast with the situation of Dina, a poor little girl locked in a torture chamber. An innocent little girl who had done nothing to deserve serious punishment was hanging on the floor, beaten and cut. And no Espito was going to leave the blissful heavens for her. The door to her cell creaked and shook barely audibly, as if Raphael and her henchmen had decided that they hadn't played enough with their hated rival and had decided to get even with her once again. Luckily, it wasn't the blondes. The door opened cautiously, letting in rays of light, and a timid, muffled voice asked if anyone was there. But another one responded with a hiss. It turned out to be a group of 3 women. These servants brought food to the prisoners so that they would not die of hunger before the end of their punishment. And now it was Dina's turn. The protagonist was so broken by the suffering she had endured that she barely reacted to it. She only gave the visitors a single, almost thoughtless glance. One of the wet nurses was horrified to see the unfortunate teenage girl, but her companions quickly explained that the main character was not actually a person, but a monster, and they treated her accordingly. The kind-hearted woman tried to object to this, but she was unceremoniously shut up. The girl was ordered to pour soup down Dina's throat, while the others held her jaws, not giving her a chance to bite off her tongue. The protagonist again cast a terrible glance at the visitors. There was no threat, hatred, or even just anger in it. On the contrary, it was the gaze of a person who was truly tired of her life. Anyone would have been taken aback and flinched at such a look, especially from a teenager. And the woman who was tasked with holding the bowl of soup was no exception. But then something supernatural happened. The girl stared into space because Dina's voice sounded in her head, giving a simple order. To free her! Perhaps someone else would have been able to resist this mystical call, but not this maid. She approached the tied-up girl with the submissiveness of a clockwork doll. Her colleagues, busy preparing for the procedure, did not notice anything at first, and only became concerned when the drugged maid freed Dina from the gag. They immediately pounced on the wet nurse with questions, but it was too late. The cloth that had been covering the protagonist's mouth for who knows how long had finally disappeared. After this, the main character returned free will to the servant, and the latter blinked in confusion, unable to understand, due to lapses in memory, what she had just done. The little brunette smiled at her with sincere gratitude. Although not of her own free will, this woman did her a favor for the first time in who knows how long, just so that Dina could commit suicide, finally putting an end to all the bullying and leaving Raphael with a donut hole instead of the miraculous blood. There was a hideous sound. Crimson drops splashed into the air, and the maids screamed in horror like frightened chickens. Their imaginations painted too detailed the consequences of the oversight. But it was too late to take any action. A couple of seconds were more than enough for the protagonist to bite off her tongue and finally die from blood loss and pain shock. It was a very pitiful and terrible end for a man who was truly the chosen one of higher powers, not to mention that it was Dina's 14th death. At first there was darkness, endless and unchanging, but then a faint whisper was heard in it, gradually turning into a shout and then into a terrible scream that woke the girl. The brunette, completely alive and healthy, looked around in horror. She had turned into a child, her skin was whole, and instead of rags, she had a cheap but whole temple dress. Huge drops of sweat ran down the heroine's body like hail, and her heart was beating as if it was trying to break through her ribs and escape at any cost. So the girl with blonde hair who had woken Dina shook her head sadly. The little girl had long and neatly groomed blonde hair, unusual red-pink eyes, and a very sweet face. She seemed like an angel descended from heaven. But looking at her, the protagonist, with great difficulty, suppressed the desire to move away. She would recognize her worst enemy and tormentor Ruffian from millions. However, the situation changed in the most radical way. Instead of gloomy dungeons stinking of dampness and rot, there were light walls covered with crosses around. Continuing to look around in fear, the little saint quickly realized that she was now in the classroom of the temple school where the priests were teaching children. The main character couldn't believe that this was reality and not a perverted continuation of torture, and Ruffian asked with noticeable concern if everything was okay. She reached out to the protagonist with her hand, and she recoiled with even greater horror, as if the little blonde was trying to throw a scary scorpion at her. An awkward atmosphere reigned. The antagonist no longer made any attempts to show concern, and Dina was shaking slightly in her seat, trying to suppress her panic. Eventually, she managed to catch her breath. Her heart began to beat a little more calmly, and the feeling of fire in her brain disappeared, so the brunette answered with difficulty that everything was fine. Naturally, this was an exaggeration bordering on an outright lie. The girl looked so beautiful that they would put her in a coffin, and if she hadn't been in class, she could well have fainted. Turning her whole body towards the protagonist, Ruffian tenderly said that they were friends, and friends were obliged to take care of each other. Otherwise, the very meaning of the term would be lost. At the end, the blonde villainess smiled the most gentle and good-natured smile possible. Even the most complete cynic would melt if he saw something like that. However, Dina was no longer impressed by such tricks. She thought with incredible bitterness that there had once been times when such a smile would have been taken at face value by her. Memory helpfully threw up one of the many memories. In it, the main character beaten lay on the floor, while a soldier with a spear and a duet of corrupt priests hung right above her. The saint desperately begged the blonde for mercy, reminding her that they were friends. But in response, Ruffian only giggled, calling it funny, and then ordered her to listen. With a smug grin, the villainess admitted that she had never in her life considered Dinah anything more than a dirty, miserable orphan. And she really wanted this fact to cause pain to the victim. The sadist achieved her goal with interest. The protagonist looked at her with such shock and horror that ordinary physical torture could never have caused. And the blonde bitch, of course, was not going to stop there. She continued to trample on the emotional wounds with all her might, asking how the brunette herself had not realized earlier how different they were. Ruffian giggled. Her eyes sparkled and covered her mouth with an elegant hand, continuing to revel in the victim's torment. And this created a very unpleasant contrast with her current feigned behavior. For a while, Dina looked at her silently, and it was hard to say what she wanted more: to smash her tormentor's skull or to run away from her to the ends of the earth. The girl's body began to shake again. Real beads of sweat rolled down her face, and the main character croaked with difficulty that she agreed to show herself to the abbess, to make sure that there were no health problems. However, the young saint continued to look at her false friend with fear. The memories of the pain that the latter had caused in past lives were too fresh, but as soon as she finished the conversation, the protagonist ran away, as if the unfortunate little girl was being pursued by angry wolves spitting foam from their mouths. The contemptuous whispers that the other children showered upon the heroine only added fuel to the fire. They discussed almost openly why such a beauty as Ruffian had even paid attention to this wretched, penniless slob. Dina continued running until she almost collided with one of the abbesses, and the woman, realizing who she had met, made a disgusted face, as if she were seeing a mangy stray dog. Trying not to show her indifference too obviously, the priestess asked what the little girl needed this time, and she lied that she had a bad headache and needed medicine. Then the priestess irritably reminded Dina that she was a complete failure. She needed to study and work twice as hard as the other children in order to keep up with them. But the girl, instead of accepting this, only complained and whined. However, the woman still agreed to give the unfortunate little girl the medicine when the latter accepted this humiliation and asked for forgiveness. And then the heroine slowly wandered away. Having barely left the hall where she could be seen by random passers-by, the protagonist fell to her knees. Now she could finally give free rein to the fear that was tearing her insides apart. As it turned out, the unfortunate woman remembered all her previous lives and deaths in every detail. How she was betrayed and used time and again by loved ones. How they turned her existence into an endless nightmare and drove her to suicide. But Dina was always reborn in the past, no matter what happened. This in itself resembled a very sophisticated and merciless torture. The little girl sincerely could not understand why the higher powers would not simply let her die in peace. But in the end, the brunette managed to pull herself together and decided to check the time. This was not idle curiosity at all. The little miracle worker needed to know the number in order to understand how far she had been thrown this time, and she went to her room. It was a fairly clean but poorly furnished room. A minimal amount of furniture, a meager row of books, and dust particles lazily floating in the air, so that the girl even thought about how everything here was unchanged despite her endless reincarnation. Having made sure that there were no strangers nearby, the protagonist took out a tattered notebook from the chest of drawers. Her diary, where all the important observations were written down. Having opened it, Dina began to absorb the information with concentration, and the readers were given the opportunity to be completely convinced that the drama was not unfolding on Earth. The language did not resemble any dialect known to Earthlings. Having reached the right place, the main character opened her eyes in fear and shock. This time, she was transported to the year 381, and not to the 82nd, the year of the High Priestess, as in the two previous reincarnations. Unlike the time travelers in other works, the girl had no idea why she was thrown into this loop or how it worked, but she made a reasonable assumption that something might have changed. A terrible thought flashed through her mind like lightning. What if this rebirth is the last one, and when Dina dies for the 14th time, she will not be reborn? For several long seconds, the protagonist considered this possibility, as if trying to decide for herself whether she should finally leave the cruel world right now. But in the end, she threw the diary away with contempt. The previous 13 lives had finally deprived the poor thing of faith in the best, so she did not want to hope for the 14th time. It didn't matter what time the main character returned. All attempts to escape from the temple boarding school were doomed to failure. She would only get herself into trouble for nothing. The girl who had lived many lives was not even sad about this. She had long since come to terms with the fact that she was doomed to start another path in this underworld over and over again. However, somewhere very deep on the very edge of the subconscious, a piece of Dima's soul desperately begged the goddess to finally stop this somehow. For some time, the protagonist tried to stoically endure her mental torment, but then, with tears in her eyes, she grabbed a large sharp knife and cut her veins in the desperate hope that at least this way she would be able to rest in peace. Drops of blood splashed onto the wooden floor, but that was all. A few moments later, the child's hand was enveloped in a supernatural golden light, and all the wounds disappeared, leaving only a reminder in the form of small scars. Someone else would have danced with joy upon discovering such a power, but the main character watched the miraculous healing with tears and inexpressible despair in her eyes. This was part of her divine blessing. Any wound inflicted by the saint would disappear very quickly and painlessly, allowing one to survive even very serious injuries. The protagonist has learned through experience that this power weakens if she is exhausted and weakened to the limit. But it is impossible to inflict sufficient damage on herself under the constant supervision of the priestesses unless some thug gets in here and kills the girl. Dina remembered the last minutes of her 13th life when she, beaten and exhausted, was in Rafian's torture chamber. Only then, when she already had one foot in the grave, she managed to kill herself by biting off her tongue. The memory of this made the poor child curl up in the fetal position, and no one could tell how much pain she had to endure for what should have been a blessing. If the protagonist had the strength to scream, she would have undoubtedly done so. But now she simply cowered, wondering how much longer she would have to go through this nightmare. It is unknown how long the main character sat frozen in horror at the future. But at some point, she slowly raised her head, looking around the room. She had obviously thought of something, because she ran out of the room with surprisingly fast and strong steps, as if no tragedy had ever happened to her. After this, the readers are shown the temple from the outside in all its glory. It was hard to even imagine that such cruelty could take place in such a magnificent building surrounded by a beautiful garden. The main highlight of this temple was a huge statue depicting the saint, thanks to whom humanity managed to withstand the monsters many centuries ago. The sculptors depicted her as a beautiful young woman in a hooded cloak and holding a spear in her hands. The protagonist seemed very small next to this architectural masterpiece, designed to demonstrate to everyone the grandeur of the church. But there was no longer any awe in her. After everything Dina had been through, even a much older and more resilient person would easily have become disillusioned with the belief in a fair and kind goddess, let alone a little innocent girl. Even before getting stuck in a terrible cycle of reincarnation, the main character's life was dangerous and difficult. She had no parents, so the little girl took care of herself from the first years begging for food on the street from passers-by. The turning point in her life was a chance meeting with a tall, gray-haired gentleman. Although if Dina had known how it would all end, she would have run away without a second thought. That man was a priest, and looking predatorily at the protagonist through his glasses, he immediately realized that this nondescript street mouse actually possessed a colossal supernatural gift. The Holy Father was not a sadist, although he did not show any particular concern for the new student. He simply gave her a roof over her head and a regular source of simple but nutritious food. The main character, even now, very clearly remembered how the stern and unfriendly nun showed her the room, the very one in which she still lives. Even then, the room looked ascetic and unchanged. The only thing that even slightly resembled luxury was a stove with a door for throwing in coal and a stove on which stood a kettle. Because of this, the protagonist didn't care how dry her new guardians were. She finally had a place she could call home, where it was warm, and she didn't have to fight for every crumb. At that time, the orphan really loved the temple and the people who worked there because they gave her hope for a better future. But those bright feelings had long since turned to ashes. Looking straight into the face of the statue of the deity as if it could answer, Dina asked seriously, "Why did the celestial punish her with such a gift? For what purposes did he go to the mortal world?" Of course, the monument couldn't give any answer. Its stone face retained the same blissful soft smile, while the brunette admitted that she was tired of feeling like a bargaining chip. The unfortunate little girl was one of the very few parishioners who begged the higher powers to send her eternal peace. It was much better than finding herself at the beginning of her life's journey again and experiencing tragedies endlessly. Of course, the statue didn't give any answer this time either. Only the wind continued to play, barely audibly, between the tree branches, moving the fallen leaves from place to place. For several minutes, the protagonist silently thought about various things, until a new thought was born in her head. As it turned out, some kind of holiday was supposed to be held in the temple. This made Dina genuinely happy, because she had come up with a better way to rest in peace. And at that moment, a shadow was shown falling across the monument's face, creating the illusion of a wider grin. After a while, the audience is again shown a magnificent view of the beautiful temple. This already lively building is now literally seething with life. The little temple servants couldn't find a place for themselves, because preparations for the holiday were in full swing. Here and there, another teenager or young man rushed with an armful of drawings books or treats. Dina was no exception. In her hands, she held a large basket filled to the brim with beautiful apples so juicy and ripe that just looking at them made your mouth water. Looking at this treasure without any expression, the protagonist mentally mentioned that representatives of the four most noble families of the empire, whose power is only slightly inferior to the emperor or the saint, would have to come to this festival. Among them will also be Archduke Devon Terenzius, one of the greatest military leaders in history, who has never lost a war, but he has a very bad reputation. This man's armies completely destroyed any enemy, leaving no one alive, which created a reputation for him as a psychopath obsessed with blood and murder. And this was precisely the key detail of the heroine's plan. She was going to attack the aristocrat. And since Terenzia is completely insane and does not differentiate between a grown man and a little girl, he will definitely finish her off. Inspired by these thoughts, the protagonist even forgot to look around, which is why at some point she ran into a taller and stronger girl. This ended in an unpleasant fall. The younger priestess didn't even think to ask if the heroine was okay, and if she needed help with the dropped apples. On the contrary, she irritably reminded her that she needed to look around. Someone else might have thrown a fit, desperately defended themselves, or made excuses. But not Dina. She was so disheartened that she rushed to apologize herself. A soft golden glow enveloped her hands, and the girl looked at them again with incredible despair and grief. The skin torn from the collision with the floor literally healed by magic. A gift that would have been the greatest gift possible for any other person turned out to be a curse for the brunette, literally breaking the fate of the unfortunate orphan. But this only further strengthened her determination. She had to anger the Grand Duke at any cost during the holiday, and then her torment would finally be over. The protagonist ran for several minutes down the partially open corridor until a voice finally called out to her. And judging by the way she became embarrassed, it was not a friend. The voice belonged to Khalid, the same blonde knight with the indifferent fish-like gaze. But now he, like Dina Rafian, was only a teenager. His full name was Khalid Demroy. And now he looked nothing like the heartless thug who had accompanied the false saint into the dungeons to obtain the miraculous blood. Unlike the brunette, this young man was born into a very noble and influential family, and besides, he enjoyed universal respect. Boys looked up to him and girls idolized him. At one time, the protagonist was among them. Let's face it, a handsome and caring man could win the heart of almost any girl, especially if before that she had only known slaps and indifference. It was all the more painful for her to realize that this was just a facade, and that in the future, this young man with emerald green eyes and golden hair would become one of her tormentors. Shortly before the end of his past life, for example, Khalid obediently carried out every word of Rafian, never once tried to contradict her, never tried to somehow protect the one who considered him a friend. He, like many other rich people, didn't care at all how much people suffered. As long as their own well-being was not affected in any way, the rest could burn in hell. Because of this, Dinah now hated Demroy almost as much as she hated the blonde, for his incredible and disgusting hypocrisy which crossed all possible boundaries. Fortunately, the little nobleman was not a mind reader at all. He thought that something was wrong with his friend and tried to find out the reasons, but the girl dryly said that everything was fine. In an even drier tone, she reminded him that she was obliged to help with the preparations for the festival, and Khalid, easily seeing the hint, stepped aside, even with some apprehension. Immediately after this, the main character rushed forward with all her might. She did not want to spend another second in the company of such an unpleasant person. And the blonde stood in place for a few seconds, looking after her, after which he scratched his head in bewilderment. He had no idea what he had done wrong to deserve such a reaction. After this, the action moves to a completely different place, and the readers are shown a huge, magnificent palace which shone under the setting sun like a huge crown surrounded by an equally beautiful green garden. The corridors of this gigantic dwelling were filled with a variety of servants, but at one point, two maids stopped and squealed with delight. After all, Mr. Ben himself had come out to greet them. They adored this man so much that as soon as they saw him, they stopped working for a moment. They wanted so much to exchange at least a few words with their idol. He was a young and very attractive green-eyed, brown-haired man, tying his long hair into an elegant ponytail. His smile alone was enough to make the girls melt with delight. When he left on business, the maids continued to whisper enthusiastically, "They say that Mr. Ben is always perfect, always dressed to the nines, and gives the impression of perfection incarnate." As it turned out, this man had been serving the Grand Duke for 10 years already, and of course, not at all because of his good looks. The man was the master of a huge network of informants. He always knew what mood reigned in the empire. Like a giant spider, the brown-haired man pulled the strings, staying informed about even the most trivial rumors. Literally, a bird could not sing outside the window without it becoming known in the smallest details. Because of this, those around him came up with a laconic saying, "Ben Teresia knows everything," which more than demonstrated the level of competence of this person in his position. However, the head of the spies was not nearly as happy about this as he tried to show to those around him. Right now, his face expressed rather universal despondency than self-satisfaction. The cause of his suffering turned out to be his overlord. Duke Devon stood in front of the mirror, dressed in a dark green military uniform and a long black cloak with a luxurious hood. The head of the family, Teresia, looked gloomily at his younger relative and asked what was wrong. From his point of view, he approached the choice of wardrobe very responsibly and carefully. As it turned out, the Archduke couldn't stand the church, and on this holiday, everyone was required to wear white clothes. Appearing in such things would be tantamount to a huge middle finger right in the face. Arguing with the all-powerful priests was practically tantamount to declaring war on the entire Austin Empire. But Devon was also a very powerful man. So Ben, feeling goosebumps running down his spine, tried to convince the head to let him choose a different suit. In response, the military leader cast only one very cold and piercing glance, after which the brown-haired man quickly abandoned his attempts, realizing that it was easier to defeat the enraged bear in hand-to-hand combat. Going downstairs, the men found themselves in a huge, luxurious living room. There were expensive red carpets everywhere, furniture made of very beautiful dark wood, and many other attributes of the rich. And there were two teenage boys, both very similar to their father in that they had gray hair and bright green eyes. And Devon asked one of them who he had fought with. The boy, whose name was Judy, tried very unconvincingly to lie that he had been running, but his flushed cheeks and the large bandage on his face gave him away. Terenzia Sr. didn't have the energy or time to figure it out, so he simply asked his son not to get into any trouble while his parent was away. And the other boy, Denny, very seriously promised his father that he would look after his sibling. The Duke replied in an equally serious tone, "Try your best," and turned away, considering the farewell conversation over. But a second later, he stopped, suddenly remembering something very important. On his way to the party, Devon was going to go shopping. And like any decent parent, he was going to buy some gifts for the kids, so he wanted to know what his brothers wanted. Denny, who loved books more than anything, and even wore large reading glasses, thought for a moment, but then gave the order. He wanted to read a unique tome written by a high-ranking priest, and such a book could only be obtained at the temple festival. When it was Judy's turn, the young daredevil clenched his fists in delight. He literally anticipated the moment when he would be able to give his dear father his cherished wish. It wasn't a weapon or a puppy, or even some rare food. Instead, the boy, without a shadow of a thought, declared that he wanted a younger sister more than anything, which left those around him momentarily dumbfounded. Having come to their senses, the adults asked again what the boy meant by this, and Judy demonstratively became capricious, waved his arms, and demanded a sister so as not to be worse than his friends. His father just rubbed his forehead in irritation and asked how much longer his son would fool around. Devon already had enough problems and worries, and now this was happening. In response, the gray-haired teenager used a tactic that children around the world have used since the beginning of time. He pouted in irritation, blushed, and stared at his uncooperative dad. To the warlord's credit, he turned out to be a much tougher nut to crack than he seemed. And when Judy realized that this tactic wouldn't work, he decided to try a more brutal approach. Turning away with as much indifference as possible, the kid replied that this was to be expected. After all, only Danny was the favorite. His wishes were fulfilled easily and simply. The man sweated slightly and bit his lip. Perhaps it was much easier for Teresa Sr. to defeat the enemy army than to explain obvious things to her capricious son. But to his credit, he still tried to get his point across to his offspring. Gently placing his hands on his shoulders, Devon began to explain that he had no favorites among his offspring. Dropping to one knee to look Judy in the eye, the Archduke informed her that if he wanted a little girlfriend so much, he would hire a maid, but he would not have a sister. The boy absent-mindedly asked why, and the aristocrat, feeling increasingly out of place, reminded them that they had no mother. For most children, that would be enough, but not for this gray-haired, lively fellow. Continuing to look at his father with sincere bewilderment, he asked why they didn't have a mother, since many other children had one. Poor Devon had trapped himself in a trap, trying to talk to his son like he was an adult. He suddenly realized that he simply couldn't bring himself to explain how babies actually happens. In desperation, Teresa Sr. decided to turn to her second son for help. And Denny, hearing his father's timid question whether at least he knew these things seriously, adjusted his glasses. The general's second son quickly made his father's jaw drop to the floor, and Judy's fists clench in triumph, because the young reader declared that it was possible to get a sister without a mother. Like all great solutions, it was extremely simple. Devon just needed to adopt an orphan, and with his status and wealth, it was a piece of cake. Some time passed, and a magnificent carriage appeared on the forest path, drawn by two thoroughbred stallions rushing forward with the speed of the wind. The carriage belonged to the Teresia family, and its patriarch, of course, was inside looking at the changing landscape outside the window with an indifferent look. Ben, who was sitting opposite him, tried to console the Duke, convincing him not to take his son's request too seriously, because you never know what kind of jokes these boys come up with. But it didn't help. Sighing heavily and looking away, Devon admitted that he too had hoped that Judy was just trying to make a joke in such an unusual way. But in the end, his conscience got the better of him, and the man decided to take any wishes of the children seriously. Like many single fathers, the general felt guilty towards his offspring for not being able to compensate for the lack of maternal love. The Archduke tried to smooth this over by giving his sons various gifts, but this only made things worse. The brothers eventually got tired of money toys, expensive clothes. Things for which other children would sell their souls for these kids became chaff, a symbol of the fact that the parent does not consider it necessary to show his love. Of course, it wasn't that Devon really didn't care about his descendants, but he wasn't an all-powerful deity either, just an ordinary person with his own flaws and limitations, and he couldn't have possibly pulled a mother and sister out of a hat for Judy and Danny. As a result, the twins spent most of their lives in the company of each other and servants, without a father who was always away at work and without any other family. Because of Teresia, Sr. felt a lot of guilt. The commander had hoped that by adopting a good girl, he would finally help his sons feel good. But Ben had much more doubts about this. It was not the easiest decision, after all. On the other hand, the spy master was used to trusting his intuition, and it didn't say that introducing an orphan into the house would bring any problems, so the brown-haired man promised to help find a suitable shelter. After this, there was another small time skip. All the guests had already gathered near the temple, including the 4 great lords who had taken the most prestigious places, and the priest was reading a welcoming speech from the stage. Devon was there too. Like the other 3 aristocrats, he sat on the stage at a distance from the priest and did not even try to hide how bored he was. Now this dull ceremony of hated sanctimonious people. The protagonist was there too. Dina was sitting in the back row and looking at the scene with longing, because she understood that getting to the target and attacking would be much more difficult than it seemed. Despite numerous reincarnations, the main character still knew little about life. Most of it was spent in the slums, the temple boarding school, or in torture chambers, and in many ways, the little girl remained naive. Because of this, she did not foresee that a random student would simply not be allowed to approach one of the greatest aristocrats of the Austin Empire. But she did not have time to finish this thought. 2 girls approached her from behind and demanded that additional chairs be brought for the guests. The orphan cast a look at them full of melancholy and despondency, and the girls immediately got angry. They decided that the protagonist had become so impudent that she was going to argue with them now. The main character didn't answer yet. She just squeezed her knee and thought that not long ago she would have followed the order without thinking it would have been the easiest thing. But now that the dream of death was so close to being realized, Dina gained a little self-confidence and finally reminded the insolent girls that the senior priestesses had given them an order. One of them literally exploded with indignation, and without embarrassment shouted that she came from a noble and rich family. So what right did a poor orphan without family or tribe have to contradict anyone? The other children joined in the bullying. They started shouting at the brunette that she had crawled out of the slums, had neither a father nor a mother, and therefore, in comparison to them, she was nothing more than an animal or a slave. These insults brought the poor little girl to tears. Perhaps even more than an end to her suffering, she dreamed of finding a loving family to feel complete. The protagonist, in order to at least slightly distract herself from this torture, turned her gaze to the side to check how the great Duke in black robes was doing. How strong was her surprise and shock when she realized that the honorary thrones, where 4 guests were supposed to be, were completely empty. Dina immediately forgot about some girls and their bullying because something much more terrible was happening. Devon Teresia. Her last hope for eternal peace had disappeared into thin air. The little girl shook her head in horror, trying to find the right person. And in those seconds, a whole horde of icy goosebumps ran down her spine because the Archduke was everything to her. Fortunately, everything turned out to be not nearly as scary as she imagined. The man had not yet left, but was already leaving the ceremonial hall accompanied by 2 bodyguards. The protagonist was about to run after him as fast as she could, but she didn't have time. She was roughly grabbed by one of the noble daughters, who was extremely outraged that some orphan dared to ignore highborn offspring. Here, an angry shout was heard from one of the nuns who was watching to make sure that the children did not misbehave during the sacred celebration, and both girls became terribly tense. The owners of the temple did not know mercy when punishing their charges. Realizing that the rod was closer than ever, the young aristocrat with a false smile declared that, no, there was no quarrel. It was just that stupid Dina had suddenly jumped up and needed to be sat back down. At the same time, unnoticed by the abbess, she turned to the main character in an attempt to force her to take all the blame on herself. Otherwise, her enraged classmates would not let her live. In another situation, perhaps the protagonist would have happily given up the offender and enjoyed listening to her pig-like squeals from the punishment room. But now there was no time or motivation for this, so she meekly admitted that she got up from her seat in order to bring seats to the guests. The poor thing mentally grabbed her head. She had trapped herself, and if she didn't figure out what to do urgently, the Archduke would simply leave disappearing from her life forever. Fortunately, this particular time, fate was kind to Dina. The priestess, not wanting to figure out who was right and who was wrong, simply sent the brunette for chairs, and she ran ignoring the mocking grimaces of the little noblewomen. Her best hope now was to intercept Devon Teresia before he left the temple grounds, and the girl furtively checked the dagger hidden in her sleeve. The required man was not in the hall, so the orphan went outside. Perhaps His Highness had not yet sat in the carriage, but was entertaining himself with a walk through the temple gardens. The protagonist ran through the corridors for several minutes, looking for the Archduke, until she suddenly stopped and stared at one point, exactly like a hunting dog that suddenly sensed the scent of prey. Yes, she was lucky this time too. She quickly found the great lord, and he had not yet left the temple grounds, but was hurrying towards them, not wanting to stay here longer than necessary. From this angle, it was easy to see how much Devon resembled a wolf, a strong and intelligent gray predator that defeats enemies not only with power, but also with intelligence. For a moment, the girl became worried. She doubted that she would be able to even get close to this man, let alone attack him with a knife. At that moment, Dina almost cried. On the one hand, she was very scared, but on the other hand, an inner voice mercilessly drove her to attack, reminding her that this was her last chance. She had no right to miss it, because such an opportunity only comes once in a lifetime, and this realization eventually made the orphan take a few steps forward. She decided to call out to the Duke. The latter lazily turned his head, hearing an unknown child's voice, but his two bodyguards immediately tensed up. Swords crossed in front of the protagonist, and she froze in fear, but still added in a trembling voice that she would like to tell the great nobleman something very important. Teresia towered over Dina like a huge snow-covered rock, and the child cringed as if imagining how this terrible man would start beating her for no reason. With difficulty suppressing the panic trembling throughout her body, the main character desperately asked for a small conversation, just for 1 minute, and then she would never disturb Devon again. The military leader looked at her with a strange gaze. It was tenacious and attentive, but at the same time, there was some other barely noticeable feeling in the Archduke's gaze. Eventually, the general ordered his servants to lower their swords, and the men reluctantly moved their blades away from the stranger, allowing their master to communicate with her in peace. The protagonist was breathing heavily, trying to regain her spirit after the stress she had experienced. Sweat was running down her face like a stream, and her heart was beating as if it was ready to explode at any moment. The guards, however, did not go anywhere. They continued to stand between the girl and the owner, and the latter calmly noted that Dina, judging by her clothes, should be one of the contenders for the title of saint. The inner voice once again reminded that the main character just needs to get the knife and then hit her target. But to do this, she will have to get closer, otherwise the blade will be immediately knocked out of her hands. So the little girl did, and no one tried to stop her. After all, what damage could a tiny and emaciated girl, even in appearance, cause to an adult, experienced warrior? The protagonist desperately mumbled and swallowed words, bit her lip, and felt like she was ready to boil from the monstrous heat. She was so afraid to do what she had planned. And at the same time, his hands automatically reached for the hidden dagger, as if they were under the control of an invisible puppeteer, mercilessly directing the plot to the climax. In an instant, Dinah, gathering all the rage, fear, and hatred that had accumulated in her, towards the world around her, rushed forward with a furious cry, trying to pierce Devon. The man recoiled and raised an eyebrow in surprise. But other than that, the Grand Duke looked completely calm and unimpressed, as if he was attacked on a daily basis. The guards screamed in fear for their master, but their help was not needed. The military leader grabbed the child's limbs with one hand and easily held them. The elder Teresia calmly noted that from the very beginning he had found it strange how Dina moved and behaved in general, but in fact she was trying to finish him off. After this, the aristocrat put the tip of his sword to the protagonist's throat and demanded that she answer his questions, and the brunette, despite wanting to die, began to sweat. The gray-haired man was used to dealing with greedy assassins who were willing to kill anyone for a reward, so he thought the girl was one of them. Still holding the main character at blade point, Devon demanded an answer as to who had sent her on this mission, while the orphan looked at the aristocrat with fear. Readers are once again shown the thoughts of the protagonist, how terribly she suffers because of her life, and how unbearable it is for her to endure one abuse after another. And the personification of all this was Raphael, a woman with the appearance of a beautiful blonde angel, but the soul of a greedy, insatiable, and cruel-hearted pig. But now, Dina was glad that everything would be finally over in a matter of moments, and she didn't want to think about the fact that reincarnation could work for the 15th time. The audience is then shown what Devon looked like from the protagonist's point of view. He resembled a giant monster whose face was hidden in shadows. The Duke coldly repeated the demand to name the names of the employers, threatening to finish off the young murderer if she did not talk. And this was all the girl needed, and she almost shook with excitement when she heard this. The head of the Teresia family looked at this with incredible disgust. He had seen many disgusting things in his life, but for such madness to happen to a child, this was something new. Meanwhile, Dinah was experiencing a real euphoria that could not be compared with any normal way to get pleasure. So dizzy was she with the realization that her time was about to come. Not wanting to wait for the weather to change, she made an instant leap forward, towards the razor-sharp blade that could easily cut through men in full armor. And this action alone truly surprised the Lord. He was used to the fact that the killers were ready to desperately bargain for their lives, but not to the fact that one of them would try to settle scores with herself. There was no longer even a hint of doubt in the brunette's eyes, only a crazy, all-consuming joy that the saving oblivion would soon come. Even religious fanatics and psychopaths didn't smile as brightly and happily as the main character did, and she didn't even try to scare anyone. It lasted for a few moments, but the feelings of the participants slowed down so much that from their point of view, it lasted for hours. But in the end, the girl remained alive, albeit injured. She was left with a serious cut on her throat, and Devon, removing the blade, commented that the girl was not trying to finish him off. On the contrary, she was trying to kill herself on him. The servants tried to make sure that the Grand Duke was okay, but he paid no attention to them. On the contrary, the man demanded an answer as to whether the church was responsible for what had happened. The little girl remained silent, not taking her eyes off the ground, and then the aristocrat coldly asked if she would remain silent until he finished her off. This outcome would have been very satisfactory for the protagonist, but unfortunately for her, the man came up with a much more sophisticated punishment, simply returning the failed killer back to the temple. The main character's eyes widened in horror, and then when Teresia turned and walked away, she screamed after him, begging him not to do this. Anything but this. The thought that she would return to this hypocritical, rotten-to-the-core monastery after such hopes morally destroyed the already broken little girl. She loudly begged Devon for execution, just not to return to the cell. The gray-haired man looked at her over his shoulder, and although his gaze might have seemed bored and lazy, in fact, the aristocrat was very carefully assessing the brunette, and she was no longer even begging. She was literally hysterical. Streams of tears were rolling from her eyes, and the Grand Duke's soldiers had to hold the young novice in place. Eventually, the protagonist screamed that she would rather die than go back to the church again, and something clearly changed in the atmosphere because Teresia turned towards her completely. The man briefly ordered the bodyguards to let the little saint go, and they, with obvious reluctance, listened to the master slowly retreating further away from the crazy girl. She no longer screamed, did not try to break free or beg for a quick death. She simply cried quietly, feeling how her already weak body was finally leaving all strength. Looming over her like a mountain, the Archduke asked how old Dina was, looking at her with mild interest, although he still showed no emotion. The brunette looked at the failed executioner with genuine surprise. She expected anything but this, but in the end, she admitted that she was 12 years old. The Lord stroked his chin in mild surprise, and it was understandable. Due to malnutrition in early childhood and severe stress, the protagonist looked at least half her age. After this, something happened that the main character definitely did not expect. Instead of leaving completely, Devon gently stroked the hapless assassin's head. She was so surprised that she didn't even say or do anything. She just silently looked into the nobleman's face, with her huge eyes reddened from sobbing. The man was very surprised, although it was difficult to say why. For a moment, Teresia simply opened his mouth, and all the words he was about to say seemed to get stuck in his throat. The military leader, to his credit, managed to quickly get over his surprise, and after that, he dropped to one knee and, looking at the little girl with some warmth, offered to become his daughter. Dina, who had not yet recovered from the previous shock, stared at the adult again. Without words, but her gaze expressed questions much more eloquently. The exchange of glances continued for some time, and then the girl very quietly and timidly clarified whether Devon really meant what he said, because she simply could not believe such luck. Some time passes, and the readers are shown how the protagonist is now sitting in a completely different place, and a bandage has finally been applied to her bloody throat. Glancing timidly at her supposed father, she asked if he was really ready to invite her into his house. And somewhere in the background, Ben was screaming hysterically that one shouldn't make such important speeches in the heat of the moment. The main character paid no more attention to these screams than to the buzzing of mosquitoes. On the contrary, he confirmed that he was just about to find a girl who could be adopted into the family. The brunette turned away so that Devon wouldn't see that she was about to cry. But she still admitted in a trembling voice that she was a commoner without a drop of noble blood. In response, the man measured her with a particularly tenacious and attentive look, as if he could not believe that the young novice had said such cosmic stupidity. In response, he only briefly asked what the big deal was, and Dina turned a timid glance to the nobleman. She in turn could not imagine that anyone would care about her origins. Realizing that the girl's psyche had been thoroughly damaged in this vile orphanage, Teresia explained that if she took his last name, she would automatically become an aristocrat. The protagonist looked at him in shock. The thought that she would actually become a noble lady, just like those hooligans from the temple, seemed incredibly exciting. But then she cut herself off, reminding herself that it was useless and even dangerous to build false hopes. And from worry, she bit her lip so hard that it almost started to bleed. The primary goal remained to escape from the orphanage, no matter in what capacity, as a young duchess or a tramp, so Dinah eventually simply quietly agreed. For the first few moments, the main character didn't answer. He simply looked at his newly made daughter with a very sad look, thinking about how much she had to endure. Assessing the protagonist from the outside, Devon replied that despite her weakness, she desperately wanted to live, to the point that she was ready to put literally everything on the line. But at the same time, when she begged to kill herself rather than return her to the priests, the girl was absolutely not lying. She was truly ready to prefer non-existence. Even such an experienced commander who had seen all possible horrors in his life was impressed by this. And now Teresia added that there was another important point. He wanted to know the name of the main character. It just so happened that during their brief acquaintance, he had not had the opportunity to find out such a banal thing. The orphan tried not to show it, but in fact, this simple question touched a certain note in her soul. Before this, no one had been interested in what the protagonist was called. The man kindly noted that the little girl had done everything correctly and warned that he would later send people to the local administration to sort out the issue with the documents. Therefore, Dina herself can only wait for her new father to come for her. And the Duke said this with a very creepy, bloodthirsty grin and a sinister look. But immediately after that, Devon stopped short, feeling a strong attack of Spanish shame. Obviously, he did not intend to scare the new member of the family, but accidentally made a scary face. The warrior tried to apologize in case he had frightened the main character, but she replied that it was nothing to worry about. On the contrary, she was enchanted by the kindness with which they looked at her. The Archduke was genuinely taken aback. He was used to his grimaces, instilling only mortal fear in those around him, and even his bodyguards began to whisper that these masterly smiles appeared to them in their nightmares. The aristocrat turned around. He had heard this gossip perfectly well, and calmly asked if the soldiers would like to make a few circles around the barracks, forcing them to bite their tongues. The protagonist eventually timidly asked when exactly she would be able to leave the hated temple, and the man admitted that they would have to inform him about this later. Only after that would she be able to be taken home. The brunette remembered that usually such an operation took about 5 days, but now there was no sadness in her head, only dreaminess and euphoria. 5 days until absolute freedom from cruel and hypocritical priests, merciless nuns, sadistic children, and ruffians. It was simply a ridiculous price. But as it turned out a little later, the main character still wanted to die and not build a new, more prosperous life. The consequences of previous reincarnations could not be so easily corrected. After a short time, skip readers are shown Devon and Ben in the office of 2 priests, and the latter incredulously asked whether the commander really wants to adopt one of the potential saints. The protagonist calmly confirmed that this was indeed the case. For another person, this might have been impossible, that the Archduke was used to overcoming impregnable walls. The priests exchanged eloquent glances. The church dogmatism that had been hammered into their souls over the years was clearly struggling with the trivial thirst for profit, even if it meant blasphemy. Finally, one of the Holy Fathers slowly responded that any child in whom miraculous abilities were discovered was the most valuable resource of the temple, and there could be no talk of handing him over to someone else. On the other hand, the priests will change their decision depending on what kind of child Teresia needs, and the latter began to slowly grind his teeth in irritation. Fortunately, the priests were not going to play out the show for too long, so they announced that they would give away a girl from the lowest category, one of those on whom no one had any particular hopes. The priest asked who exactly Devon wanted to bring into his line, and the Duke, looking down, named Dina. It was difficult for him to talk about her after what had happened. The temple servants began to check the list in bewilderment. The protagonist, to put it mildly, was not popular, so her name was known to few. Eventually, they found the right person, but asked if Teresia was sure of her choice. After all, the main character is absolutely untalented, and it would be easy to choose a more capable child. The commander was genuinely angered by this, because the priests were talking about the unfortunate broken child as if he were some kind of mongrel. So Devon asked in a very cold tone who dared to doubt his decisions, who was tired of his rotten language. The temple servants were horrified to see the legendary warlord in all his nightmarish glory. But before the situation could become too dire, Ben intervened. Shatton, unlike his leader and relative, tried his best to feign optimism and friendliness in order to smooth over the conflict. And besides, he had a gift. It turned out to be a receipt, meaning that a certain amount of money was to be deposited into the priest's account. And judging by the way their faces lengthened, it was huge. And so it was. Ben Teresia was ready to give the greedy saints 1,000,000 errands, an absolutely gigantic sum, if only they would quickly shut up and make concessions. A little more time passed, and the conversation obviously came to an end, because the aristocrats began to leave, and if Devon did not even try to pretend to be friendly, then the brown-haired man, on the contrary, remained polite and respectful to the very end. The spy master said goodbye cordially and reminded the priests that he was counting on their help, and they, inspired by the joy of their newfound wealth, were ready to get even a star from the sky, let alone give up one girl. They continued to shout after the visitors for some time, thanking them for their donations, but no one was listening to them anymore. Even Ben, hurrying after the Archduke, simply breathed a sigh of relief, glad that everything had ended so easily. As soon as the guests had finally left the office, the Holy Fathers began to whisper greedily. Of course, they did not even think of giving the money for the needs of their church, but wanted to divide it strictly among themselves. And besides, they openly made fun of the Teresians. From their point of view, a bribe to adopt the talentless Dina was like buying a decrepit nag for money, worthy of a thoroughbred stallion. But at this point, the focus of the story changes, returning again to the protagonist. She has removed the bandage from her neck and noted without surprise that the cut from the sword has completely healed. Then the former orphan ran to the window, wondering whether she could go out now or whether the restrictions of the hated temple orphanage still applied to her. The brunette had spent most of her childhood in her previous lives in confinement. Due to her holy abilities, she was never allowed to go out without supervision, and now it was very unusual to realize her freedoms. But at the same time, the girl tried to constantly remind herself that she shouldn't rely too much on the word of the Grand Duke. Everyone knows that aristocrats and rich people are very capricious and fickle tomorrow. Devon might not even remember her face. But even if the man kept his word and really took Dina to his estate, he already had 2 biological sons. And this circumstance frightened the protagonist. Because of her hard life in the church, the brunette became convinced that rich people were vicious, envious, and evil, and that they would mercilessly trample anyone who could not fight back. For a moment, the main character imagined this picture. How even after adoption, she continues to be cruelly abused, treated like a powerless slave, and ridiculed. The little saint sighed heavily and sat down, hugging her knees. She told herself that it didn't matter anymore, because her old goal to end her life was still relevant. You just have to wait for the right moment, when no one will be able to stop her. And until then, Dina will easily endure the ridicule and bullying that have already become habitual. At least one day passed after that, because the golden-orange sunset sky was once again replaced by midday azure and snow-white sheep-like clouds. The protagonist walked towards the exit of the shelter, accompanied by a strict nun, and the woman constantly reminded her former ward how to behave with influential people. The main character was mostly silent, but at some point she couldn't take it anymore. When the mentor ordered her not to even think about returning to the church, the little girl asked what she should do if Teresa kicked her out. The Holy Mother Superior, who was supposed to be filled with mercy for all living things indifferently and mercilessly, replied that these would be Dina's problems alone. In this terrible loop of reincarnations, the brunette managed to see many disgusting things, but mentally she still shuddered. After all, how much hypocrisy and other crap is hidden on the Holy Land? And it was even more disgusting to realize that once the little girl sincerely considered this place her home, she truly respected the local saints, not understanding that the latter were only concerned with how to grab more money and fill their bellies. With these very bitter and sad thoughts, the protagonist continued to obediently walk behind the nun until she suddenly saw something, or better to say, someone. Yes, it was Raphael. The red-eyed blonde was walking through the temple when she suddenly ran into the girl whose life she had ruined so many times in previous lives. No, this was not some strange intrigue on the part of the antagonist. She really was going somewhere on her own business, and the sudden meeting with Dina so early in the morning surprised her quite a bit. Unlike the main character, whom the nun continued to treat with undisguised contempt, the woman addressed the blonde novice much more respectfully, even calling her Miss. Raphael said that she was going to pray, although no one believed it. But the girl did not give them a chance to catch her in a lie, and instead began to ask where the brunette was going. The protagonist felt goosebumps start running between her shoulder blades again, and looked away. She really didn't want to have anything to do with such a bloodthirsty beast. Unfortunately, the nun ruined everything. She just blurted out that from that day on, Dina would no longer be an orphan and would join the family of Devon Tunisia himself, one of the greatest nobles of the Austin Empire. The blonde opened her scarlet eyes wide in deep shock, and her usual honey smile became downright fake. It took a lot of effort for her to force herself to speak calmly. But to Raphael's credit, she pulled herself together quickly enough. She was a natural-born schemer and actress, so she easily portrayed a sincere request to say goodbye to her best friend. The main character would rather have given up the hand than follow this monster anywhere, but she had no choice. The nun tenderly agreed, and the blonde girl dragged her companion into the depths of the garden. Dina Teresia hurried with great difficulty after her better-fed and healthier friend, and perhaps would have asked her to stop, but she eventually froze and grabbed the brunette by the shoulders. Raphael, looking straight into the eyes of the victim, demanded an answer as to whether Devon had really adopted her, and what was the reason for this. Had the stern warrior suddenly found an illegitimate daughter? Trying not to lose consciousness from fear, the protagonist answered that everything was not so, and after that, the blonde asked directly, if the brunette was not the daughter of the Archduke, then why did he need her? From her point of view, it was really very strange. The fact that Dina was very bad at healing others and performing other miracles was no secret. So why on earth would a person of such caliber need her? In another situation, the main character might have been scared and trembled, like a rabbit suddenly confronted by a wolf. But now she was triumphant that her false friend had shown her true colors. Rafian herself realized that she had gone too far, so she quickly returned to a carefree and friendly attitude, asking for an apology for being too harsh. The schemer also tried to pretend that she was feeling incredible sadness because her best friend, with whom she had experienced so many adventures, was leaving for many years, if not forever. In order to soften the heart and finally lull the little duchess's suspicions, the blonde made a very sad and touching face, one that could captivate even a mad tiger. But the protagonist was not moved by this performance in the least. She even giggled mentally, watching how her tormentor diligently pretended to be an angel. And then, for the first time in the entire story, the main character decided to show her teeth. She stared at Rafian with a very piercing and creepy look, and the atmosphere around them changed dramatically. To say that the brunette was angry was the same as saying that the ocean was wet. In fact, Dina fell into an all-consuming, insane rage. The little girl had suffered too many times from this blonde bitch during her 13 lives, and she was not going to forgive it firmly, deciding that one day she would make her opponent go through all the circles of hell alive. But she did not express these intentions out loud, since she knew how to be hypocritical no worse than Rafian. Instead, the young noblewoman modestly said that she was also sad, and that she really felt sorry for her friend. After this, Dina touchingly took the second girl by the hands, trying to portray that she also deeply appreciated her and was grieving over the separation. Squeezing the blonde's hands a little harder than she should have, the protagonist expressed her hope that she would definitely become the next head of the church. But in reality, she would like for that to never happen. While the main character was saying out loud that the blonde babe would make a first-class saint, she actually thought that for all the suffering she had caused, she would be forced to experience hell herself. Despite the fact that, from the outside, everything looked very sweet and touching, Rafian looked at the brunette with concern and even fear, as if she felt that something else was hidden behind all these honeyed words. In the end, young Teresia thought that she really hoped that her tormentor would suffer such terrible and endless misfortunes in the future that she would not be able to smile even through force. This was the last straw. The schemer now, with an openly frightened and concerned face, pulled her hands away and tried to move away from her former girlfriend. But the protagonist was not upset at all. She had already fully enjoyed the fear of her sworn enemy, and now, for the first time in a very long time, she felt satisfaction. Rafian, having regained her composure calmly, thanked Dina for all these blessings, but horror continued to lurk in the depths of her ruby-red eyes. In order not to remain in debt, the main villain responded in the same innocent tone that she hoped that the brunette's future family life would also be happy. After that, the girls finally began to go about their business, and the blonde schemer, looking over her shoulder with apprehension, wondered, what the hell was that all about? Despite Dina's best efforts to hide her true emotions, it didn't escape Rafian's notice that the protagonist was particularly depressed, and only a blind person could fail to notice her bloodthirsty gaze. Because of this, the blonde couldn't shake the feeling that the main character had guessed everything, all her schemes, intrigues, and various bullying behind her back. For a moment, the antagonist was very angry that some brat was able to see through her true intentions so easily. But again, she quickly pulled herself together. Looking off into the distance with feigned indifference, Rafian reassured herself that this unforeseen factor was of no importance in principle. She and Dina were not destined to ever meet again anyway. After this, the readers are shown a completely different time and place. It was a beautiful night with a bright full moon, and on the marble balcony stood a beautiful, red-eyed woman with chestnut hair, whose name was Irene. Someone quietly but distinctly called out this strange girl's name. She turned around at the sound of the voice and then smiled affectionately, seeing who exactly was calling her. It turned out to be Devon Teresia, but then he didn't look anything like the terrifying general. The man looked and smiled with all possible affection when he asked what Irene was doing on the balcony on a cool night. The brunette admitted that she had been watching the stars and asked if the Archduke thought the night skies were beautiful, urging him to look up carefully. The girl was not exaggerating. At that time, the sky really did look fantastic, as if some divine artist had used the heavens as a huge canvas when he created an image of a perfect night. However, this was far from the most magical thing that Devon Teresia saw or heard at that moment. His wife quietly but tenderly announced that they were going to have a child and a girl. After this, the story returns to the present moment. The main character was leaving the shelter, looking around the space around her, with a thoughtful and slightly clouded gaze. She still had a large bag in her hands, which contained her personal belongings, and the ever-memorable nun pointed to the path and indicated that they had to follow it, because at the end, Dina would have to be picked up. Considering her duty fulfilled, the Holy Mother ordered the now former orphan to move her legs, and she herself, without wasting a single second, went back to the temple. A few moments later, the large wooden gates slammed shut with a loud noise, symbolizing that this extremely joyless and dull stage of the protagonist's existence had come to an end. For some time, the girl did not dare to move from her place. She simply stood and stared at the gate, as if trying to read in it a message known only to hers. But then, a gentle ray of sunshine softly fell on the baby's face like a mother's gentle hand, and she, unable to bear it, closed her crimson-pink eyes. The sun was at the very zenith of its radiance. It brightly but softly illuminated the earth below, like a giant guiding lantern by which the main character could find a new path into the future. As she looked around the deceptively beautiful temple for the last time, Dina admitted to herself that she had never been able to do this before. Finally get a good ending for herself. Previous reincarnations invariably ended the same way, no matter what methods the brunette used. She was betrayed then, thrown into prison, and tortured repeatedly. And when the girl somehow stopped her suffering, it didn't change anything either. Some higher power simply rewound time a few minutes into the future, forcing her to relive the entire horror all over again. But now, feeling the soft warmth of the sun spread across her skin and the wind playing with her long, milk chocolate-colored hair, the protagonist realized that everything would be different. The young saint has already managed to avoid two of the most terrible events for herself: a lifelong stay on the territory of the hated church and imprisonment in the Raphian dungeons. The realization that she had literally, against all odds, escaped yet another nightmarish ending filled the little heroine's body with previously unknown confidence and strength. And just at that moment, Ben met her. While the man addressed Dina very respectfully, as if she were a real noble lady, she herself experienced a serious thrill at the sight of such a luxurious carriage. Seeing the confusion of the newly minted mistress, the spy master decided to introduce himself. He called himself the assistant of the Grand Duke and assured that it would be an honor for him to serve the main heroine. The protagonist felt seriously confused. Before, he had never even thought of addressing her in such a way. But pulling herself together, the little girl politely greeted him in response. Thus, the two brown-haired women greeted each other, not as a mistress and a subordinate, or an adult free person with a young, disenfranchised orphan, but as two well-mannered and polite individuals. However, Ben then came to his senses and assured the girl that she should not bow to him, and the main character was confused because she did not know how else she should behave. In response, the man smiled slightly, forcedly, feeling a drop of sweat running down his temple. Most likely he had suspected before that there would be problems with raising the new duchess. But only now he realized that there was literally a lot of work to do. Looking straight into her eyes, Ben reminded Dina that she was no longer some pupil of a corrupt temple. She was a representative of the Teresia family, one of the most powerful clans in the entire Austin realm. Moreover, in the entire empire, only one person has the right to the title of Archduke, and he is the head of the Devon family, who is also the baby's adoptive parent. This opened up simply colossal opportunities, but also imposed certain obligations. For example, now the protagonist had to change her behavior in order to adequately reflect the status of her new surname. Smiling good-naturedly, the man admitted that he understood the main character's confusion. She simply wasn't used to such an environment yet, but that wasn't a big deal. Now she would have plenty of time to get used to everything. However, it was actually very difficult for the little girl to get used to the idea that she was no longer a despised, downtrodden orphan, but the only daughter of the greatest nobleman in the empire, second only to the emperor himself. However, there was no time to waste, so Dinah, without asking any more questions, climbed into the carriage with a determined look, while Ben continued to bow respectfully. When all the passengers had taken their seats, the coachman whipped the horses, and they slowly pulled the structure forward. And after that, the protagonist thanked the people for stopping by to pick her up. A second later, it became clear that the girl was not addressing the brown-haired man, but the Grand Duke Devon himself. He was also in the carriage and was looking at his newly made daughter with an attentive gaze. The man continued to stare at the little girl with his emerald green eyes for a few seconds, before slowly replying that he always kept his promises. The way it was said confused Dina, because Teresa Sr. didn't say it in the familiar boastful tone, but in a very calm and casual tone, as if he were giving a weather forecast. But on the other hand, the protagonist would be much more pleased to deal with a callous and indifferent but honest person who does not hide his true attitude than with a heartless hypocrite who lures victims with honeyed smiles like Rayfion's. The mere memory of this blonde monster sent a cold shiver through the main character. She instinctively pulled her head into her shoulders and hugged herself with her arms as if saving herself from the icy wind. At this point, the short exchange of lines ended, and for some time the main characters rode in complete silence, but it did not escape the Archduke's notice that the brunette had moved as far away from him as possible. From the outside, this man seemed frightening, sinister, and simply heartless to many, but now he seriously thought, was the protagonist really behaving this way because she was uneasy? To his lordship's credit, he was willing to admit that it was entirely his fault. After all, how else should one react to a man who, on first meeting him, was ready to mercilessly cut out a child's throat? Realizing that it would be simply awkward to continue driving in complete silence, the main character decided to ask, "Are all of Dina's things in the bag that she took with her from the shelter?" The girl confirmed this, and was greatly embarrassed to hear that Devon had made the ironclad decision to buy her a lot of additional things in addition to these shabby rags. The protagonist tried to convince her adoptive father that she didn't need to buy anything, and mentally added that it was simply pointless. She still hadn't changed her mind about killing herself. The Duke himself, it must be admitted, also felt very awkward. He easily gave orders on the battlefield and fought with his fighters in the front ranks, but he had no idea how to behave with little girls. Dana remained closed and constrained like a hedgehog curled up in a ball, and the man simply did not know how best to give in to her without causing harm. If the brunette had overwhelmed him with wishes from the doorway like Judy, it would have been much easier. Because of this, the main character could not understand what his adopted daughter really needed until suddenly, like a flash of lightning, a thought was born in his head. He wanted to give the baby a new name. This made the Archduke recall a dialogue with his wife. Then, standing on the balcony and announcing her pregnancy, Irene expressed a desire to give their baby a bright and sonorous name that would resemble a star. The romantic woman also wanted this name to fully reflect her colossal love for her unborn child, and to be something like a lucky talisman. Having escaped from the abyss of memory, Devon remained silent for a while, before quietly but firmly saying the word attracting the attention of the protagonist. Esther. When the girl looked at her adoptive father, the Grand Duke explained that he wanted to demonstrate in this way the symbolism of the transition from a past stage of life to a new, fundamentally different one. Therefore, his wish is that from this moment on, the girl's name will not be Dina, but Esther, which translated from one of the ancient languages means bright as a star. Hearing this, the little girl almost panicked because she had no idea how to react to such an attitude. Unlike fear and pain, she was not used to tenderness. She remembered all her tragic previous lives again, how she was tortured for the sake of the miraculous blood. And in the end, she declared, she does not deserve the bright glow and must wander in pitch darkness as before. The protagonist could have suffered and humiliated herself for a long time, but Devon did not give her such an opportunity. With one short word, the adoptive father forced the heroine to stop. No, the military leader was not going to scold and punish his adopted child. On the contrary, he quietly assured the brunette that she would shine like no one else, becoming the only Lady Teresia in the world. And only her own decisions will determine how her future fate will turn out. No one else, including the thrice-cursed temple, has any more relation to the girl. The former Dina was experiencing a fit of tormenting doubts. On the one hand, she was still going to kill herself as soon as the right opportunity arose, but on the other hand, it sounded really nice. She clenched her fists until her knuckles turned white, because the choice was simply incredibly difficult: to commit suicide or continue to live, but with a much more beautiful nickname. Unable to bear this dilemma, Esther simply burst into tears. She really wanted this beautiful name, even if it turned out that she would wear it for only a few days or even hours. Trying not to smear snot and tears across her face, the girl thanked her adoptive parent for this gift, and after that silence reigned in the carriage for a long period of time again. The coachman sat on the box, occasionally checking the horses' movements. The animals rhythmically stamped their hooves on the ground, and Teresia Sr. looked askance at his neighbor in the cabin. He thought that the former Dina had looked very scared up until that moment, ready to curl up into a ball at any suspicious sound. But now, on the contrary, she had fallen asleep peacefully, as any carefree child would do. Moreover, it dramatically changed her appearance. Now, Esther in no way resembled a bony homeless puppy, suffering from all possible beatings and diseases. The Archduke remembered how she had begged with incredible despair not to return her to the temple after the failed assassination attempt, and admitted to himself that he would not want to see such horror anywhere else except on the battlefield. War, of course, also brings nightmares and monstrous wounds, but at least this is expected. And here, on the other hand, is a 12-year-old child who was raised by priests on sacred land, but was ready to die, just not to return to the holy monastery. The man seriously considered what the protagonist might have gone through to cause her such mental damage before paying close attention to her current clothing. Devin Teresia looked even more closely. As unfamiliar as this man was with women's clothing, even he realized how dirty and old Esther's things were, and after this, the military leader clenched his hand into a fist, and with such terrible force that if at that moment he had tried to shake someone's hand, he would most likely have crushed the bones into powder. The aristocrat thought with inexpressible hatred of the temple priests, of those hypocrites who preach humility and other virtues in the name of God, while in reality they glut themselves and splash about in luxury, while such orphans starve and suffer from poverty. Having regained his self-control, the protagonist called Ben, who had been riding a horse next to the carriage the whole time. As it turned out, the commander had decided to immediately stop by a women's clothing store. The brown-haired man asked in confusion whether his master really intended to do this, and Devin, once again beginning to lose patience, declared categorically that they were going to Odar Street immediately. Then, the audience is shown a completely different place, in a fantastically beautiful garden reminiscent of a divine park. The protagonist and an unknown boy were sitting on a bench discussing Teresia Sr. The boy asked what the Duke was like as a person, and the girl, hiding her eyes, admitted that she herself had no idea. But the fact was that the gray-haired general was special. Unlike most people she knew, especially a certain red-eyed blonde. Devin spoke his mind and kept his promises, and that was enough to calm the boy down. He admitted that he was worried about the fate of the main character, but since she did not fall into the hands of another schemer who dreams of robbing more goods, then everything will be fine. So far, no one has tried to explain to the audience what kind of child this is, how Esther knows him, and why he hasn't shown up before. But the boy assured that he always watches the brunette. What was happening became even more surreal, as often happens with various dreams. But for now, the former orphan remained calm, not even thinking about waking up screaming. But looking straight into the mysterious boy's face, partially hidden by his long bangs, the protagonist asked a direct question. "Who is this kid anyway?" The boy smiled with the corner of his lips, like a teacher pleased that his student had finally asked him a sensible question, and perhaps would even have answered it. But at that very moment, Esther was awakened. The little girl quickly apologized for daring to fall asleep, but Devin was not at all bothered by this. He simply replied that they needed to go to a certain place. The main character, rubbing her pink eyes, had difficulty realizing what exactly was happening around her. But even in this state, she understood that something unusual was about to happen. The patriarch of the Teresia clan noted that the place they were going to visit was famous among the locals, and then the camera clearly shows a huge, bright and beautiful medieval building, a store known as Christina's Boutique. The protagonist looked at this with her small mouth slightly open, and her father, not even trying to hide his smug grin, noted that the brunette needed to update her wardrobe items. The former pupil of the temple orphanage froze with her jaw hanging open. She, accustomed to poverty, cold and hunger, simply could not understand how one should relate to such things. A red-haired woman, in a luxurious yellow dress, came out to meet the family, apparently the owner of the establishment. Grumbling good-naturedly, she asked why she had not been warned in advance about the visit of such an important guest. They were obviously old acquaintances, as Devon had no problem with the rather familiar treatment, and he was sorry for the inconvenience. But one young lady urgently needed some new clothes. The businesswoman didn't notice Esther right away, but there was nothing strange about that. Due to learned shyness, the little girl preferred to hide from strangers whenever possible. And besides, her insecure head was tormented by a very unpleasant thought. What if this socialite refuses to have anything to do with her declaring that the protagonist is dirty like a pig? But nothing like that happened in the end, quite the opposite. The red-haired lady dropped to one knee, took the girl by the hand, and promised to see what she could choose here. Christina then asked with a gentle smile what her little client's name was. And for a moment, the heroine, confused, even gave her old name before Devon quickly interrupted her mentioning Esther. The girl wisely decided to name the former orphan after the star. And after that, the men went outside, allowing the ladies to fully concentrate on finding suitable things. This scared the brunette a little, because she didn't know how to behave in such situations. But in the end, she was seated on a soft sofa and asked to wait a few minutes. To keep her from getting bored, Christina gave young Teresha catalogs with dresses of various styles, but the girl still had no idea what to do with all of it. To say that the little girl felt out of place would be a huge understatement. Her face literally showed how much she would give for the opportunity to hide in a narrow, dark corner. In the end, she couldn't stand it any longer and asked the owner of the luxury boutique if she wasn't disgusted that some tramp in dirty rags was dirtying an expensive sofa with her butt. For a few seconds, the businesswoman simply humbled the young visitor with an uncomprehending look. She sincerely could not understand what kind of problem she had suddenly discovered. But then she carefreely assured her that everything was fine. After this, Esther again felt seriously embarrassed and had to remind herself that she was no longer in the temple with its draconian laws for children. There, holy fathers and mothers mercilessly punished people like her for literally the most trivial mistakes. For example, they could force them to stand on their knees for a long time with their hands raised high until they ached from the terrible tension, because the orphans dared to sit on someone's chair. Now that the protagonist had acquired a new name, surname, and colossal influence, thanks to her adoptive father, everything was different. But it was very unusual to realize this, so the brunette was still lost in many ways. However, Esther had the good manners and courage to thank the boutique owner out loud for the conveniences provided, and then she was lost in her own thoughts for a long time. No matter how carefree Christina seemed from the outside, she was not stupid. It never escaped her notice that the baby was holding on like a prisoner who could be hanged for any sneeze, and the businesswoman could not stop thinking about where the Archduke got this child from. But after some hesitation, the woman decided to impress such a difficult client with her professionalism. After all, it was not for her pretty eyes that she was considered one of the most sought-after entrepreneurs in high society. The main character stared in horror at the luxurious pink and white dress, and the store owner, shining like the sun itself in human form, advertised it as the latest hit of the season, perfectly complementing Esther's delicate fair skin. Seeing such an unexpected and unusual reaction, Christina asked if the little girl really didn't like something, but the protagonist hastened to assure that the clothes were in perfect order. Then the red-haired businesswoman continued to take out one dress after another, offering more and more sophisticated and luxurious options, while the brunette felt the tread of horror more and more strongly. Then the lady suggested that the client look through the catalog. Perhaps there she would be able to find the most suitable model for herself. And little Teresha realized with embarrassment that this businesswoman specialized in expensive but discreet outfits without flashy luxury. But when Esther still showed no enthusiasm for any outfit, Christina authoritatively declared that with her visual qualities, almost any dress would suit her. Even though the situation still seemed very embarrassing to the former orphan, she did not miss the rare compliment about her appearance and asked if it was really so. The businesswoman responded with great enthusiasm, as if she were a little child who had been let into a real treasure cave. Dressing up beautiful girls was her cherished dream and the meaning of her life. After this, the red-haired lady extended her hand to the main character, and she had difficulty suppressing the desire to recoil, which over all her previous lives had become ingrained in her flesh and blood. Smiling and blinking good-naturedly, Christina asked Esther for the opportunity to help her, at the same time demonstrating that she certainly did not wish harm to the little visitor, and that the magic would soon begin. The protagonist stared at her in response, with a timid, barely suppressed hope. On the one hand, some part of her soul really wanted to see the promised magic, and the other, beaten by life, was afraid of it. As it turned out, the heroine still dreamed of ending her life, despite the fact that she had finally begun to turn to her with the best possible side. But on the other hand, it will always be possible to find an unprincipled mercenary who is ready to cut even children for money. But for now, the former Dina decided not to deny herself the pleasure of enjoying her newfound position. The past was a long time ago. Devon and Ben Teresia had returned long ago and were now in the main hall, waiting with all their might for the return of the newly minted Duchess. The military leader closed his emerald eyes in irritation, wondering if women always took so long to fuss over dresses and suits, when his assistant finally announced that the baby was back. The protagonist immediately opened his eyes and assumed his previous position. He personally perhaps did not care about expensive clothes, especially women's, but he clearly did not want to offend his adopted daughter with indifference. What he saw made the usually cool and steadfast lord freeze with wide-open eyes. Exactly the expression on the faces of the ancestors of the Imperials might have seen the descent of the savior from the heavens. In reality, it was just Esther, with a lifeless, doll-like expression on her face, having swapped her rags for a beautiful blue dress. But she looked exactly like Devon's former flame Irene, like a rejuvenated copy of Hershey. Because of this, the main character was immersed in his own thoughts for a long time. The rest of the world ceased to exist for him. Only the name of his long-departed wife remained. Before finally coming to his senses, the governor managed to think, "If we had a daughter, she would," and then declared out loud that this model looked great on the girl. Then the man finished his thought. He too noticed the uncanny resemblance, and admitted that this was exactly the appearance his daughter from Irene could have had if things had gone differently. Esther, meanwhile, blushed deeply from the compliment, and then lowered her head in an attempt to hide her gaze, and quickly began to chatter that she was incredibly happy just from trying it on. Her new relatives, getting into a frenzy, offered the protagonist to try on the other available models, and she, already on the verge of horror, refused, claiming that she no longer needed anything. Unfortunately, the Grand Duke remained deaf to her pleas. He calmly stated that they had as much money as they wanted, so they could do as they pleased. Christina, who had retreated into the background, clasped her hands in admiration and pressed them to her heart. She was very pleased to watch what was happening because she considered the heroine cute. They continued to dress the former orphan in one dress after another, not even thinking about stopping. They were overcome by some kind of morbid courage, because of which they could not tear themselves away. This especially concerned the boutique owner herself. While the men were still somehow able to control themselves, the business lady seemed to have turned into a child who had been given a new toy. But eventually, Devon Teresia clearly decided that they had had enough for today, so at some point, without turning around, he called over his faithful assistant. As it turned out, the Archduke decided to buy all the dresses that Christina offered his daughter, and poor Ben had a hard time keeping himself from cursing. After that, some kind of nightmare began. The businesswoman got into a frenzy again and began dressing up a profitable client in ever-new outfits, forcing the poor guy to mentally cry from the crazy amount of unnecessary expenses. However, he was not the only one who suffered. After many hours of trying on clothes, the unfortunate Esther also felt as if she could at any moment, without moving from her place, give her soul to the goddess, and no miraculous powers would help. Luckily for her, this was the end of all the trials. Devon bought his new child 7 new and very expensive suits and was about to set off when Christina called out to him with a question. What will happen to the hand-me-downs that the brunette was wearing initially? Without batting an eyelid, the military leader announced that he had thrown away the rags because the protagonist would no longer need such things, and this made the girl reluctantly rise from her seat. Her face again assumed the painful expression of those unfortunate people who were on the verge of fainting from hunger, and a large drop of cold sweat rolled down it. She thought that, yes, of course, she should not relax at all. At any moment, they could stick a knife in her back and then throw her out again like a puppet that has played its role. But at the same time, fresh memories stubbornly crept into her head about how kind and good-natured Christina had been with her, in no way reminiscent of the cruel nuns from the temple. All this gave the protagonist a persistent feeling that she had found herself in some kind of fairy tale, like the one where a fairy appeared to an unfortunate woman deprived by fate and changed everything with the wave of a magic wand. For the first time in a long time, the main character did not torment herself with bad thoughts about dangers and self-harm. On the contrary, she admitted that even if all this was just a dream, she did not want to wake up from it. After an unknown amount of time, the carriage with the main characters arrived at the Archduke's palace, and he only finally reinforced with his beauty the feeling that what was happening was reminiscent of some kind of fable. Looking at all this splendor and realizing that this was now her home, Esther again began to look as if she was about to fall with a huge fever, and Devon meanwhile began to give orders to the servants. The protagonist cast a strange and intent glance at the adults, but they did not notice anything. Both Ben and Duke Teresia himself were completely absorbed in the affairs that had accumulated during their absence. The reason for this excitement of the main character turned out to be as it is not difficult to guess the blood offspring of His Highness. In the girl's imagination, they appeared as two evil monsters who, with a hyena laugh, were preparing to torture her. Meanwhile, Teresia's servants put on a real show. Dozens of footmen, pages and maids of various ages lined up at the main entrance and, respectfully closing their eyes, congratulated the ruler on his return. In the main hall, the main characters were awaited by a tall and very strong middle-aged man with blonde hair and a thick mustache, apparently the Grand Duke's butler. Respectfully placing his hand on his body, the eldest of the servants informed the master that his sons were still remaining on the upper floors, and apart from that, life began to return to its usual course of events. Ben giving orders, and the younger footmen and maids dispersing in their own directions. She was the only one who, for obvious reasons, felt very uncomfortable with Esther. She had never seen so many important men and women looking up to her, rather than the other way around. Meanwhile, Devon, having received the first report on the most important thing, ordered to call them, but did not even have time to finish the sentence when a loud "Dad!" was heard throughout the estate. Naturally, these turned out to be restless twins. One could get the impression that they, like two huge vultures, had been carefully guarding the yard all this time, wanting not to miss their father's return. But in fact, this was not the case. The boys simply had such keen hearing that they quickly heard a familiar voice and immediately ran to check if they had been deceived. The main character glanced at her newfound relatives with slight fear. The moment she had been waiting for and fearing had finally arrived. Judy, who obviously liked to talk more than think, immediately began to bombard his parent with questions about this strange little thing, while his brother Danny cast an appraising glance at the girl. The protagonist hid behind the Archduke in mild horror, fearing that the bullying would begin right now, while the man himself ordered his offspring to choose his words more carefully. The gray-haired boy responded irritably, asking what else he could call a completely unfamiliar girl, and looked away. From the first meeting, it became clear that he was the grumpier of the twins. On the other hand, his sibling continued to look at his new relative with a very meaningful and unchildishly intelligent gaze. There was no aggression in it, but it was also extremely difficult to read any thoughts. And this seemed to Esther more sinister than the rudeness of the straightforward Judy. These appraising glances were too reminiscent of the adult and juvenile intriguers in the temple. Cold shivers ran down the brunette's spine, and her heart seemed to skip a beat. What at first seemed like a fairy tale had revealed its unsightly interior. However, only Esther herself and Teresia's bespectacled son noticed this tense atmosphere as if filled with cold and ash. Everyone else was calmly going about their business. Only now Devon deigned to officially introduce Dina's ex as a new member of the family, so the twins, as befits gentlemen, are obliged to greet her politely. The smarter brother with the book didn't show any particular emotion, but the energetic and spontaneous Judy almost dropped his jaw to the floor, to the great embarrassment of the heroine herself. In her mind, the former orphan repeated that yes, of course, this was exactly what was to be expected. After all, she was practically a stranger to these two, so they would treat her accordingly. The brunette sighed, casting a languid but tragic glance at those around her, as if she was telling them that they could mock her as much as they wanted. She was used to it anyway. But in reality, everything happened a little differently, Instead of tripping her, spitting in her face, pulling out a clump of hair, or doing some other nasty thing, the young nobleman simply asked if the girl was younger than himself. Taken aback, the protagonist didn't even have time to answer. Judy declared, a second later, that having a younger one was really cool, and with eyes shining with delight, asked her father when he had even managed to make her. Teresa Sr. was saved from awkward explanations by his second offspring. Danny, mercilessly pinching his brother on the cheek, ordered him to stop talking nonsense and reminded him that they were dealing with a half-relative. Rubbing his eyes and forehead tiredly, the Archduke admitted that it was true. Esther would live with them for some time, but he was unable to finish the sentence because the baby was bursting with energy. Having unhooked his boring twin, Judy again pressed the main character, demanding to know her name and where she was from, while again not giving her the opportunity to open her mouth. The military leader, increasingly uncomfortable with his offspring's behavior, tried to calm him down, but to no avail. He might as well have shouted over a hurricane, but Esther still managed to find an opportunity to respond. She honestly admitted that she came from the temple, and the white-haired child tactlessly suggested that his father had picked up the protagonist, and that was the last straw. Devon used his trademark aura of intimidation, which he had previously used to intimidate corrupt priests, and tried to suppress Esther. This, as well as the promise to call a certain tutor, was enough to calm his son down. With slight horror, the kid assured that he understood everything, and it wouldn't happen again, after which he was about to leave. But before that, he warned the heroine that they would talk again. However, the general was not going to let the mischievous offspring go so easily. He calmly ordered him to stay a little longer, and Judy froze with a false smile like a statue. Luckily for him, his father had no intention of punishing him for any misdeeds. Instead, Teresa Sr. reminded him that Esther had a duty to get to know the house, and it was not hard to guess who that duty fell on. But the boy himself was definitely not happy with this. So much so that he defiantly answered his parent that in fact he had important things to do and his friends were waiting. But if you need to show someone the house list and explain everything, then there is an ideal candidate for this in the person of the nerd, Denny, especially since he is always at home anyway. But it was too late. The bespectacled man had already disappeared. And the main character, of course, did not miss the opportunity to once again make fun of his son, asking in a very ominous tone whether the latter was refusing to fulfill his father's request. Judy felt the icy chills running down his spine again and a lump forming in his throat. Perhaps he wanted to challenge his parent, but he knew in his mind that nothing good would come of it. Therefore, as it was not difficult to guess, the boy preferred to swallow his pride and began to show Esther her new home. Here was the office where Devon worked. Here was the place where guests could spend the night. As the young man warned, he and his twin lived on the 4th floor, but the little girl could take one of the rooms on the 3rd floor as her personal quarters. However, the brunette listened to him with half an ear, because her eyes darted from so much gilding and red. It was absolutely not like the ascetic poor rooms of most young saints in the temple. There you see, if you had a clean bed, then you were already considered more valuable than others. Therefore, compared to her previous rooms, the Teresa family estate looked like a real paradise. But Judy himself did not pay much attention to the reaction of his ward. He was much more concerned about the fact that today was the day when a fight was planned, but now it was impossible to take part in it. But there was no need to consider the young man a capricious and callous egoist. He continued to watch the protagonist with half an eye, and at some point noted her uncanny resemblance to Mother Irene. It is unknown what this would have led to in the end, but then fate itself intervened. Esther stared somewhere to the right, unable to tear her gaze away, to the bewilderment of her adopted brother. The main character's pink-red eyes had sparkled like two cut rubies before, but this time they literally shone, reflecting the light of an unseen treasure. It turned out to be a room as incredibly expensive as all the other rooms in this palace. Everywhere you look, there is sparkling gilding and copper elite furniture and expensive carpets. Someone else might have found it tasteless, but a child who had lived many lives, knowing nothing but constant beatings, humiliation and death, was enchanted. And Judy didn't like it at all. He pounced on the heroine with slight fear, asking if she was really going to take this particular room for herself. And the brunette, quickly becoming embarrassed, promised to settle in another. The boy hesitated, not knowing how best to justify his sharp reaction. In fact, he used this room to secretly escape from his father's stern gaze. But you can't explain that to the brunette, so it all ended with the kid staring at the girl for a few seconds, with his mouth open like a fool. And it was as if an invisible Cupid flew through the atmosphere, spreading an aura of romance. The unfortunate little nobleman was literally frozen. He had no idea what to do, because life had hardly ever confronted him with such trials before. Not wanting to seem like a real fool or a hooligan, the little boy eventually graciously allowed Esther to live there, but on the condition that she would then go with him to Sebastian. The main character asked in confusion who he was, but Judy didn't explain that either. He just waved his hand lazily and assured her that he was an idiot. And while the former orphan was still trying to come to her senses, the cunning little aristocrat used a gesture that has long been considered a symbol of an iron oath among many children, a promise on little fingers. He raised his hand to the protagonist's face and asked if she was ready to give the floor. And if the music had been playing at that moment, it would have stopped, dramatically emphasizing how serious this was. Esther copied the gesture in bewilderment, clearly not fully understanding what it all meant, but that was understandable. With her biographies, it would be difficult to learn about the traditions of children's entertainment. But at the same time, she did not want to spoil her relationship with her newly acquired relative, who already had a tough character, so she took an oath. Just at that moment, a mustachioed man in a butler's uniform appeared on stage. As it turned out, he was looking for the main character to warn her that the Archduke wanted to see her. The kids immediately made stony faces, demonstrating with their whole appearance that nothing had happened. They had not made any secret agreements behind the adults' backs. No. As it turned out, a few minutes later, Devon Teresia had called his adopted daughter not to give her something to do or to make her sit down to study. On the contrary, he had set a huge table of sweets. The brunette looked at it with her signature dead fish look, which she used almost every time she saw something out of the ordinary. And given her history, there was probably more food in the living room right now than she had ever seen. Soon the commander himself joined the feast, wearing a simple white shirt and home pants, and the girl noted in passing that he clearly had a sweet tooth. There was another awkward silence between the main characters, and Devon asked if anything had happened. And when Esther assured him that nothing had happened, the aristocrat thought that it was all strange. He had been told that the little girl loved cookies, but now she remained indifferent to the treats. As it turned out, a few seconds later, the Grand Duke did have some business with his adopted daughter. According to the laws of this world, the adoption procedure was considered completely complete and official only after the child himself had signed it. Just one short signature, and Dina the slut from the temple would officially become Esther Teresia, and the church would never dare touch her again with even a finger. It was difficult for the brunette to even fully comprehend this. It all seemed like some kind of dream, and her soul told her that such complex things could not be done so simply, but the brunette still pulled herself together and put her signature. It happened somehow quickly and awkwardly, while Devon was sincerely happy and congratulated the little girl on finding a full home. She herself felt out of place. This did not escape the adults' attention. The commander really expected the protagonist to start rejoicing, but she not only remained indifferent, but also seemed to become even more despondent. Still unable to think of what could have gone wrong, the gray-haired commander looked away. He didn't say anything else, because after that, any phrases seemed terribly false. At the same time, the main character was staring at the floor. She didn't even try to look at the luxurious treats, and was only thinking whether it was time to go on vacation. But as it turned out, Patriarch Teresia was not going to back down so easily. At some point, he came close to the brunette and offered her a piece of chocolate chip cookie. And the protagonist, as expected, was not so much flattered as frightened by this. After all, she didn't even feel the moment when the much larger man moved to the next chair. However, she did not become picky. Esther obediently bit off a piece of the offered dessert, tasted it properly, and literally turned pink with terrible pleasure. From her point of view, it was something incredibly delicious, in no way comparable to the wretched food from the temple. And Devon could not resist a smug grin watching this. Looking her straight in the eyes with confidence, the protagonist informed her that from that moment on, she could eat whatever she wanted, and in general, not deny herself anything. The dark days were behind her, and from that moment on, eternal happiness began. As the Archduke had done several times in the past, He used a voice that left no doubt in his interlocutor's mind. This was not an empty boast or even a promise, but simply a plan of action that would definitely be carried out. Before the focus finally changed to the knight, almost completely asleep castle, the blonde hastened to assure that the reason for such an attitude was very simple. He now sincerely sees Esther as his daughter. This is not part of some intrigue or agreement. Then, readers were shown Devon again. This time he was not smiling, and was in a dark kitchen where he listened with a sad face to the butler's report that the protagonist had fallen asleep. His answer was a laconic, "I understand." Now the main character no longer resembled a warm and loving adoptive parent, but rather a ruthless commander determining the plans of the campaign. The impression was reinforced by the fact that the main character was not alone in the room. Both of his sons were also sitting next to him, although they should have been in bed long ago. Danny, as usual, was serious and focused, while his brother, on the contrary, maintained a carefree grin, but at the same time, characteristically, did not take his eyes off his father. This time, the Grand Duke was silent for a long time. He clearly needed to collect his thoughts to understand how best to approach such a slippery topic, but he could not immediately think of how. But in the end, the military leader came to some conclusions, or on the contrary, overcame himself. And in the end, squeezing out words like grains of gold, he announced the beginning of a family meeting. However, this moment was not shown to the audience. A time skip occurred again, showing readers the ducal castle in all its glory in the rays of the dawn sun. The protagonist was in her new room, but she wasn't lying on the bed, but on the contrary, she was sitting on the floor and curled up into a ball, wrapped from head to toe in a long blanket. It was too bright for her, but at the same time, Esther slept very well, better than she ever had before, because the lifestyle of a beggarly vagabond or a disenfranchised servant in a corrupt temple does not contribute to long and pleasant sleep. Plus, it shouldn't be forgotten that in her past lives, the heroine usually spent time in damp dungeons waiting for Raphael to come for blood again. The newly minted Teresia could have spent a long time mentally feeling sorry for herself and reflecting on how unusual it was to simply see and feel the sun in the window. But then, she was interrupted by someone's good-natured voice. It turned out to be Dorothy the maid Devon had appointed as his daughter's personal servant. She had blonde hair, bottomless yellow-green eyes, and a joyful smile. Esther reflexively replied that everything was fine and asked how the blonde was feeling, and immediately got into trouble because the maid wanted to be relaxed with her, otherwise the officialdom made her feel bad. The brunette began to apologize in response, but the maid took pity and said that everything was fine. The young lady would still have plenty of time to get used to the local order. Now it was time to get down to the actual work. That is, to help the hostess get dressed and tidy herself up for the coming day, because noble ladies are obliged to always look beautiful. A short time skip a change of frame, and now the little girl dressed in a beautiful, expensive dress, with an expression of universal despondency and sadness, looks at something in front of her. As it turned out, they were maids working on preparing breakfast. And at first glance, there was nothing wrong with this. The women were calmly carrying out their usual task. But it quickly became clear where Esther saw the problem. To be precise, she had not noticed that a unique place at the table had been prepared, especially for her. Someone else might not have even noticed anything and calmly sat down on the first chair waiting for lunch. But the girl immediately fell into depression, deciding that everyone here hated her and did not want to respect her. But then a slightly irritated voice came from behind. Its owner was wondering why the protagonist was still standing there like a pillar instead of finally sitting down and having breakfast. It turned out to be Danny. As before, the young duke wore large reading glasses, which he never parted with, and looked extremely serious, like a life-beaten old man and not a little boy with an army of loyal servants. And just like the first time the young man looked at his new sister with a very intent gaze, it was impossible to see any overt hostility in it, but there was no hint of friendliness either. This lasted only a moment. Then the kid turned his gaze to the table, chuckled, and explained that the maids had not yet had time to prepare a place for the new mistress. But that was still no reason to just stand there. The boy led the girl into the living room, grumbling at his brother for sleeping late again, and in the meantime, it was as if an invisible mountain had fallen from the shoulders of the main character. Because of the tragedies she had experienced, she became monstrously suspicious and could see even the most harmless gesture as a sign of hatred or at the very least disdain, and a simpler and more logical explanation did not come to mind. The dinner of the two high-born offspring of Teresia took place in complete silence. Esther still did not understand what she could talk about with Danny, and he himself was not eager to help her with this. For some time, the bespectacled young man simply looked at the main character, but eventually decided to ask her one simple question. What was her name? Having received the answer, the boy ordered a servant named Gelbert to pour water for the protagonist, and immediately after that, as if out of thin air, a huge mustachioed man in a black suit appeared next to her, looking at his foster sister with a little more warmth. Now the little boy explained that if he drinks a glass of plain water at the beginning of the day, it will improve the functioning of his stomach, so he does this after every awakening. The main character, unsurprisingly, did not know this. The temple clearly did not consider it necessary to explain many elementary things to its wards, and Danny admonished her that she needed to develop useful habits. Looking at her reflection in the rippling water surface, the protagonist thought sadly that her new older brother didn't like her. It was quite noticeable, and it was even more surprising that he was the one who started a dialogue with her instead of mocking her, or at least ignoring her like she was empty space. The boy himself looked at the brunette with a slight smile on his lips and remembered the night meeting. As it turned out, then Devon only told his sons that Esther really was his adopted daughter. This was not a joke. Therefore, the Archduke demanded that she be treated as an equal. He would not tolerate jokes about her poor and homeless origins, not to mention bullying. While saying all this, the man stared intently at Judy, first of all, and when he was indignant about why they always expected some kind of problems from him, the commander mercilessly replied that he usually created them. The family squabble, however, died down as quickly as it had begun, after which the protagonist warned that he had not adopted the orphan because his sons had asked him to. He clearly saw some great value in her, so he demanded that, in the future, the brothers protect her as if they had originally been born of the same woman. At the same time, Devon looked frankly strange, as if he had been struck by some kind of love spell, because now nothing reminded him of the usually calm and detached commander. Before going to bed, the man once again asked his sons to try to find a common language with their new adopted sister so that no problems would arise in the family. This highly uncharacteristic behavior did not escape Danny's notice. Even now, reliving the memories of the night's conversation, he noted how strange it was for their father to suddenly care so much about someone else. Then the young man concentrated and looked at the protagonist again through the lenses of his glasses. At this moment, he was very reminiscent of an adult cold-blooded scientist trying to study an unusual microorganism. What is characteristic is that this is almost what happened. The boy was trying to understand what secrets Esther was hiding since she was able to charm their parents so much, and the brunette meanwhile finished her water and said that it was delicious. This comment made the kid genuinely surprised. Such concepts as water and taste, in his understanding, were practically incompatible, but the main character did not explain how in the temple they were given bad, poorly purified water to drink. And then something very strange happened. The room split from a loud, emphatically optimistic voice, and Divine Teresia himself appeared before the children in a strange suit of yellow, green, and white colors, which made him look like a lemon. If the man had planned to make a positive impression on his offspring in this way, he had miscalculated. Instead, they only stared at the nobleman with such looks as if the latter had grown huge horns. A very embarrassing and awkward moment had arrived. Deep down, the protagonist expected that the brunette would immediately fall in love with him like a father and would call him accordingly and not use official titles, although reason told him that this was impossible. To somehow smooth over the unpleasant impression, Teresia Sr., sitting at the head of the table, announced that since this was his first breakfast together with Esther, he had ordered the cook to work especially carefully on the dishes. Looking at the girl with sincere parental concern, the man expressed the hope that she would really like the food. Now it was hard to believe that this man had once almost killed the heroine. The protagonist, however, felt awkward again, because she was not used to all this and had no idea how to eat in high society, although her soul was still warmed by the knowledge that here she would not be treated like furniture or dirt. And then she flinched, because there was a sudden and loud clanging of metal. But no, it was not mysterious villains with swords breaking into the palace, but only a knife and a plate. Danny, his eyes closed in concentration, clutched a knife and fork in his hands, and then banged one against the other. At this moment, he looked very much like a small Eastern teacher who was about to explain great wisdom to his students. Esther looked at this with her mouth slightly open and her pink eyes bulging. Was this really how her adopted brother explained how to behave at the table without even saying a word? From her point of view, it sounded very logical. Somehow the young man realized that she was at a dead end and decided to demonstrate how it should be done without saying it out loud, so as not to disgrace the girl. But a second later, the silver-haired teenager glanced at the brunette. It was his characteristic piercing gaze, in which it was impossible to read ordinary emotions. The protagonist felt as if she had been struck by an electric shock. Danny was so observant, as if he simply read the thoughts of those around him. But then she came to her senses and grabbed the cutlery. The Duke watched all this without trying to interfere. It was simply not necessary, since the commander actually liked everything he was observing in the living room. But then the commander smiled peacefully, like a man who was preparing to pass away to a better world, with the feeling that he had given the world the best he could. It was so pleasant to realize that at least one son would not cause trouble. After this, there was a small time skip. Esther was sitting on a chair, and Dorothy was braiding her hair when someone approached them with a message from the second Duke's offspring, Judy. As it turned out, this was connected with yesterday's promise, which the main character gave while exploring her new room. She herself thought that the boy had long forgotten about it, but as it turned out, he remembered everything perfectly well, and now wanted to get his. It was not nice to go back on her word, especially in such a situation, so the protagonist asked the servant out loud to tell her brother that she would come where he asked. Dorothy smiled broadly and blushed as she heard this, just like a romance lover who had finally seen her favorite characters kiss. As she explained, Esther blushed without noticing it. And from the maid's point of view, this was a sign that the young mistress was looking forward to meeting Judy with great impatience. Upon learning this, the main character almost fainted from monstrous embarrassment. The maid was completely right, because the brunette, in fact, had never been invited anywhere in any of her previous lives. Be that as it may, no one was going to cancel the walk in the beautiful park, so the former orphan did not forbid Dorothy to go with her taking a picnic basket. The said park looked very beautiful, especially on such a bright and sunny day. The rays playfully shimmered between the leaves, and the fountains gave a feeling of spring coolness and freshness. For this trip, the maid dressed the main character in a practical but still pretentious costume with flower-shaped decorations, and from the brunette's face, it was clear that it made her feel a little awkward. As it turned out later, Esther subconsciously expected that the park would actually be a stereotypical dense forest where it was impossible to take a step out from behind the bushes, but the reality turned out to be completely different. And it is understandable because this garden was created by the best specialists in Austin. Dorothy took a lot of juicy fruits to the picnic, just looking at which made drool start running down her lips. And while Judy had not yet appeared, the blonde suggested that the hostess rest on a bench. The protagonist once again thought that no one in the temple had ever even tried to treat her like that, so the little things that most people didn't even pay attention to were taken very close to her heart, which the little girl herself admitted. The same promised to come to Sebastian. For most children, this would be nothing more than a way to while away the evening in a fun fight, but the girl perceived it almost as a declaration of eternal love. Blushing deeply at the thought of what adventures might await her with the arrival of her adopted brother, the main character mentally expressed the hope that Judy would come soon. Some time passes, and the readers are shown a close-up of Dorothy's face. She still looked relaxed and slightly smiling, but now she had to put in a lot of effort to look that way. As it turned out, a really long time had passed, so much so that the azure sunny afternoon had given way to a crimson sunset, and the little Duke had not even thought of appearing at the agreed-upon place. Esther felt incredibly awkward, while her maid understood that most likely the young master had simply forgotten about his own plan, because in his head there was not even a wind but a real typhoon. So now it was more important to figure out what to do with the heroine. The brunette had really hoped for this meeting, but in the end, it turns out she was simply deceived. And the blonde felt that the little girl was hurt because of this, so she tried to choose her words very carefully. The protagonist, however, did not give her assistant a chance to finish speaking. Instead, she gently took her hand and then, with a rosy smile, asked her to wait a little longer. Defending her adopted brother, she mentioned that the latter had some business, so most likely Judy had not forgotten anything. He was just busy working, but he would definitely show up soon. In any case, the brunette herself really wanted to believe it. As already mentioned, she took even the most trivial manifestations of warmth or their absence very seriously, so she desperately believed that the first walk would be ideal. As for Dorothy, her face almost split from incredible emotion. The blonde thought that her mistress was so young, but at the same time so sensible, that it simply went beyond all bounds. Suddenly, a very angry and grumpy voice was heard, which made both girls quickly look at each other. The owner of this voice was scolding young Teresia in every possible way, and calling the fact that he had acquired a sister nonsense. The maid immediately tensed up and began to sweat slightly because she instantly recognized the young man who had so easily sneezed at the son of the most powerful nobleman in the empire, while Esther had not yet realized the extent of the danger. The stranger who spoke turned out to be a very fat, black-haired boy, about the same age as Devon's twin sons. Sweating and adjusting his clothes, he addressed the protagonist directly. The young brunette angrily asked if she really was the much-praised newfound younger sister of Judy, and the main character just stared at him in confusion. This time, the many times experienced premonition of trouble betrayed the mistress, so the former orphan calmly confirmed that yes, she was the very girl in question. Then she asked her new acquaintance who he was, and the fat boy listened to this with his eyebrows raised in bewilderment, as if the boy could not believe that someone had the courage to do such an impudence. It quickly dawned on the main character that she had unwittingly done or said something wrong, and Esther was clearly about to ask for forgiveness, but she didn't have time. Without any warning, the boy approached the protagonist and then grabbed her hand, and in comparison to his own, the brunette's limb seemed fragile and thin like a twig. The former orphan tried to break free in horror, but to no avail. The difference in strength was too great, and the fat man noted with contempt that Judy had no pride left at all since he sent some girl in his place. He also insulted her appearance, saying that the heroine had nothing to grab onto, but then he let go of her hand. Fortunately, at that moment, Dorothy was already begging the guy to stop. As it turned out, this aggressive boy was the same Sebastian that the young Duke wanted to visit, and now the brunette demanded an answer from the protagonist about how much she was paid for this work. Moreover, looming over the victim like a hill and grinning predatorily, the fat man promised to double the amount, and this caused beads of cold sweat to run down the face of Dina's ex. It was too reminiscent of the dark days spent in the temple, when the brunette was not a person, but simply a toy for beating a walking tool or a wineskin with miraculous blood. For the main character, it was a real post-traumatic stress disorder, so she was physically unable to respond, and Dorothy finally threatened to call the Archduke. Sebastian tried his best not to show it, but now goosebumps ran down his own spine. For the first time, he thought about the fact that this stranger could really be the new daughter of the famous military leader. In order to have the last word, the brunette angrily declared that Esther looked absolutely nothing like her supposed relatives, and in general, where did she come from? Which humiliated her even more, pointing an accusing finger at her and calling her cheap. The fat man added that the main character would never be able to compare to his own little sister, and Dorothy groaned desperately. In another situation, she might have called the guards long ago, or even kicked the impudent fellow herself, but Sebastian was not a street urchin, but an aristocrat. So he got away with threatening another little noblewoman, having menacingly declared at the end that belonging to the Teresia family does not provide an absolute shield, and that he personally intends to turn her existence into hell. The guy finally left the protagonist alone, feeling with relief how the fear of Devon's revenge goes away. The girls took some time to recover from what had happened, but the blonde quickly came to her senses when she noticed that her charge was hiding her face and desperately wanted to sit down. Dorothy tried to convince the lady not to take the words and actions of this fat man to heart, but to no avail. Sebastian had already touched the most serious wounds in the soul of the victim. She curled up on the bench in a fetal position and began to eat herself again, thinking about what had happened and imagining how it would be repeated many times in the future. The good-natured maid looked at this with horror. She had no idea how she could help the brunette without worsening the already difficult situation and without running into the owner's wrath. Meanwhile, the sun began to set even more strongly, as if emphasizing how decadent and gloomy the day had become, which had begun relatively cheerfully and carefree. It is unknown how long the protagonist would have sat there, hugging her skinny knees with her hands, when a very cheerful and cocky bark was heard right next to her. When the girl raised her face in surprise, it turned out that these sounds were made by a cute and friendly dog with light fur, who was poking her nose almost into her face. There was another moment of awkward silence. Just recently, Esther was grieving over her hard life, and now such a cute and friendly animal stood in front of her. As Dorothy explained, this was not a stray dog who had been allowed into the aristocrat's territory by some misunderstanding. He was Judy's pet, and his name was Smiley. As the protagonist could see, this name suited him very well, because the dog radiated optimism with literally every cell of his body. It was worth petting him, and an aura of laughter seemed to spread through the air. As a token of gratitude, the dog immediately began to lick the brunette's face, and all the bad mood after the bullying was lifted from her, as if by the wave of a magic wand. Dorothy, still looking at the young lady with concern, asked if they should return home, but the girl, to her surprise, refused to leave the park, no matter what. Meanwhile, the day was rapidly drawing to an end. The sun had almost disappeared behind the horizon, and the skies were becoming increasingly dark, preparing to give way to night. Even Esther didn't want to wait for her stepbrother anymore, after the unpleasant incident. But on the other hand, she had a new wonderful friend next to her, even if it was on 4 legs. So the protagonist eventually decided to just sit in the sun, enjoying the pleasant company, and the way the fading rays caressed her skin with their warmth. For her, this was a very new and pleasant feeling. Meanwhile, the audience is shown a completely different place, and a very familiar silhouette of a thin, fair-haired boy breathes a sigh of relief. Well, that's it, it's all over. As it turned out, Judy spent all this time at some auction. Someone told him that they would sell a talking bird there, so the teenager patiently waited for the opportunity to buy such a miracle. But in the end, it turned out to be just a lie. Still grumbling irritably, the young man demanded an answer from his servant as to what time it was, and upon receiving it, he hissed irritably, as if to say yes, he had wasted so much time in vain. At the same time, the boy actually felt seriously guilty towards Esther for breaking his promise, despite the fact that he himself had imposed it on her. But he tried to calm himself down by the fact that she had long since gone home. The teenager preferred not to think about the fact that the main character could still be in the park and patiently waiting for her adopted brother to remember their agreement. He tried with all his might to drive these uncomfortable thoughts out of his head, but without much result. They constantly returned and tormented him worse than even his father's reproaches. At some point, the shame became so heavy that Judy literally slumped his shoulders and neck, and his carefree hands thrown behind his head began to look as if they were tied. And to distract himself, the boy went for a walk. All alone, fearing no one, the young man walked along a path in the park. The setting sun barely made its way through the thick crowns of the trees, and the wind gently played with the leaves. And at some point, the young duke saw a strange sight. 2 suspiciously familiar female figures, one of which belonged to a child, were doing something and having fun. The boy was so taken aback that he immediately dropped his feigned nonchalance and dropped his hands. In his heart, he guessed that this would be how it would be, but seeing it in real life was still a shock. At some point, the boy must have sighed too loudly or broken a branch that was under his feet, because Esther heard his arrival and turned around. At that moment, the teenager's heart seemed to skip a few beats, because in the rays of the setting sun, the brunette looked surprisingly beautiful, like an angel, not a person. The main character was about to ask her adopted brother about something, but she didn't have time, because Judy, screaming wildly, ran up to her, called her a fool, and asked what the hell she was doing. To say that the boy was terribly angry would be an understatement, but he was angry not so much at Esther as such, but at himself, for allowing himself to treat her so meanly, and now he received living confirmation of this. The girl calmly tried to ask what was wrong, and only after that did young Teresia realize how much he was making his already extremely ugly behavior worse. At first, he wanted to explain that he had not wanted to lose his temper, and ask for forgiveness. But he immediately forgot about it when he suddenly saw Smiley, and when Esther replied that she had not been expecting him or anyone else. Looking at her adopted relative without much emotion, the protagonist explained that she simply liked being there, which is why she spent half a day in the park. Devon's son froze in shock, feeling a cold bead of sweat slowly trickle down his neck. He had expected anything, even swearing, and attempts to fight, but not this. And then something strange happened. Having said vaguely, "Since you're here then," the main character suddenly approached the young man and leaned towards his hand as if a wound had suddenly opened there. But of course, nothing of the sort turned out to be true, and Esther did not want to go into any explanations, leaving the gray-haired teenager to ponder this in bewilderment. Eventually, Judy decided to do something strange too. He suddenly stood in front of the brunette, dropped to his knees, and arched his back, putting his hands behind her. In other words, he was literally offering the protagonist to sit on his back like a servant and ride on her. And he brushed aside all timid attempts to refuse and ordered her to quickly sit down. The brunette felt terribly awkward about the situation, but she didn't dare argue either, so she ended up climbing onto the guy's back, holding onto his shoulders while Dorothy and Smiley watched. When the teenager slightly unsteadily began to rise, the girl fearfully asked Mr. Judy if it was hard for him and if he would hurt his back, because if so, she would immediately get off. In response, the young man only turned around irritably and asked how many more times Esther was going to address him in this way, like a powerless servant to a feudal lord. The girl mumbled in confusion, trying to come up with some kind of answer, and then the boy reminded her to call him brother. After all, they were family. The protagonist understood what he was getting at, and she felt very awkward again, but now in a positive sense of the word. And she fulfilled Judy's request, calling him brother. For a moment, the teenager stopped after that feeling. His heart began to beat stronger and faster, and the blood rushed to his face. This was a very new feeling for him. For a while, the children moved in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, until Devon's blood son finally apologized for being late, feeling very ashamed of it. The brunette tried to make out his face for a few seconds, but then good-naturedly replied that everything was fine, because the main thing was that the boy had come at all. But he added that this was not an apology, and that this would not happen again. The main character admitted that the wait wasn't all that hard, because she had a good time, and Judy couldn't help but tease him. That meant she had waited after all, no matter what she had lied about before. In a fit of nobility, the boy also ordered his adopted sister to never tell anyone again that she was waiting for someone, because he would mercilessly punish anyone who made her wait in the first place. The protagonist simply stared ahead for a few seconds, her eyes wide with shock. She really did take even the simplest hints of kindness too close to heart. After all the nightmares she had to endure in the dungeons of Rayfian, and the humiliation from the temple abbots or students, this was like a balm for the soul. And the main character herself did not notice at what moment she most banally fell asleep on the boy's back, causing him to slow down and turn around in surprise. In his surprise, he began to wake his friend with questions to find out if she was asleep, and Dorothy, feeling awkward and touched by this scene, explained that Esther was very tired during the day. Oddly enough, this behavior actually flattered Judy, because now he began to truly feel like an older brother who had to take care of someone who was younger and more defenseless. And then he thought with longing that if he had known in advance that one day he would have to carry this girl on his own back, he would have definitely started training. It wasn't that the protagonist weighed much more than her thin frame would suggest. On the contrary, she was very light, but Judy, despite his energy, was weak even by children's standards. From that moment on, a small time skip occurred again. At least an hour passed, when the young man, drenched in sweat and barely able to hold on to his trembling limbs, hobbled to the estate. Despite the monstrous fatigue, the teenager did not regret anything, and even swore to himself that from that moment on, Esther's wishes would be the most important thing to him. And Danny watched this from the castle. He calmly watched as the stunned servants ran around the young master, trying to offer their help as he angrily shouted at them and forced the sleepy protagonist to get down on the ground. Judy's twin brother continued to look at this without any expression. Even the most experienced psychologist would hardly be able to find out what was going on in the head of this cunning boy. But if some telepathic wizard had looked in there, he would have been very surprised, because behind the dispassionate gaze, the baby was repeating the same memory over and over again, namely, the words of the twin about how he wanted to have a sister. After this, readers are shown a strange black landscape dotted with small stars and glowing lines, something you might see if you close your eyes tightly. This turned out to be no coincidence. The main character was sleeping at that moment, and what the audience could see earlier was part of her phantasmagorical but beautiful dream. But after a few moments, it became clear that this dream was much stranger than it might have seemed at first. Someone's thin hand approached the girl's head. Luckily, her owner wasn't anything like Rafian, so he didn't try to strangle the victim while she was in a vulnerable state. Instead, he just stroked her forehead. A few more seconds, and it became clear that the night visitor was a nameless boy, with bangs covering his eyes, whom the protagonist had already met in a dream when Devon had just announced his desire to take her to his home. The strange young man woke up the main character, but not for real. Rather, he caused her to enter a state similar to lucid dreaming, allowing her to conduct a full-fledged dialogue. And it also became known that Esther perfectly remembers the previous visits of the mysterious teenager and wonders herself what they are connected with, and also that her cheeks were flushed and her eyes were moist, not because of lovesickness, but illness. During the short time skip that occurred after the end of the walk with Judy, the brunette managed to get sick and was now lying around with a serious fever. But to the great relief of the night visitor, she was already starting to get better. The long-haired boy, unable to bear it tenderly, hugged the protagonist's hand and then lay down on her chest as if he loved her more than anything in the world. And she herself continued to mentally wonder who he was. She, from what she could remember of her 13 past lives, could have sworn that she had never seen this man. Yet he continued to return to her mind time and time again, and it was doubly strange considering that the stranger was incredibly kind. And Esther, for whom even the most banal gesture of goodwill was something unique, would certainly not have forgotten such a cutie in a normal situation. But after that, the protagonist again fell into a deep sleep and began to gradually forget about all the oddities associated with the long-haired teenager and his attitude. Some time passed, and she finally came to her senses in the real world, which was immediately noticed by those around her. Someone's insanely joyful voice ordered her to immediately go and report to the Archduke. Devon didn't keep us waiting long, appearing in the room with his daughter, not even in a matter of minutes, but in seconds. But even before him, a worried Judy was on duty at the main character's bed. From him, the brunette and the readers learned that after the walk, the girl really did get a very serious fever, so much so that she lay unconscious for 2 whole days. Getting a serious illness, especially when your body is weakened by a hard life, is bad enough, but finding out that it knocked you out for a whole day and almost killed you was even worse. But what was 1,000 times worse was that the fever, as the protagonist believed, could become a signal of her awakening holy abilities, which she hated with all her heart. Esther was so frightened by this thought that she did not immediately realize that she was sitting on the bed, furiously crumpling the blanket with her fingers, and the worried father and son were watching her every movement very carefully and anxiously. Realizing that she had unwittingly caused even more worry to her already frightened relatives, the little girl bowed her head and asked for forgiveness. In response, Devon continued to look at her very intently. The man was clearly trying to understand whether everything was really okay with his girl, or whether some other measures were needed. But having come to some conclusions, the Grand Duke simply sighed with relief and, quietly chuckling, stroked his adopted daughter's head as if she were a cute little kitten. At the same time, the aristocrat answered her that there was no need to apologize for such things, and that she was probably born sickly. But Esther, blushing with embarrassment, replied that no, she rarely had to be ill. Then the commander suggested that the brunette had caught a cold on the way home, since the path from the palace to the park was quite long, and that it would be better to consult the doctor again. Judy, listening to all this noticeably, began to sweat, and as if by chance quietly moved away from his father, as if he considered everything that had happened to be his fault. And this did not escape the attention of the main character. But as it turned out later, it was not a matter of guilt that could gnaw at the boy from within. The young nobleman simply prepared a gift for his adopted sister in the form of a plush pink rabbit. It was awkward for both of them. The teenager had hardly ever given gifts to women before, so he talked nonsense out of excitement and the heroine had to realize that she was considered like such a toy. Despite this, the protagonist was not angry, and deep down, she truly liked the gift, so it was not thrown away as soon as the visitors left the little girl's chambers. And besides this, Esther's thoughts were completely occupied with the thought of divine energy. She herself was not yet completely sure, but she thought that the full awakening of miraculous abilities was not far off. But this happened much earlier than the period that was considered normal in the temple. However, it is possible that the abnormal development of the gift was influenced by the move to the Duke. And then the protagonist remembered the strange teenager with long bangs from her dreams. This time, she even managed to see his eyes. They had black coal-like irises. This little guy had visited her in her dreams several times already. He never did anything bad. But on the contrary, he caressed and helped her with all his might like the most ideal friend and lover. Just remembering how he hugged her and took her hand this time made her feel an unusual rush of warmth throughout her body, and she hugged the stuffed rabbit tightly. It is unknown how long the main character would have lain in this position, reflecting on the visits of an unknown boy in her dreams when there was a knock on the door and someone's voice asked for permission to enter. Almost jumping up in surprise, Esther gave her permission, and then the door swung open. Behind it was the faithful Dorothy, accompanied by several other people, including a man in glasses. As it turned out, the Duke wasn't joking when he talked about showing his adopted daughter to the doctor. He had just arrived, and now he had to make sure that such troubles would not happen again in the near future. This made everything swim before her eyes, and her head spin, while the doctor assured the worried maids that there was no reason to worry. He did not earn his bread and butter for nothing. Some time passed, and now Esther, looking like a little zombie, almost begged the doctor to stop the unpleasant examination, convincing him that everything was fine. At this point, Duke Devon himself entered the room. He had just finished work, and of course, could not refuse the opportunity to go and check on how his child was doing. Having critically examined the result, he noted that the main character began to look even worse than before and cast a cold glance at the doctor. And the protagonist hastened to assure that everything was fine, she was just tired. Realizing that the danger had passed, the doctor replied that he had not found any signs of illness yet, but to be completely sure the procedure had to be completed. And the girl mentally replied that of course he would find a bunch of illnesses in her later. Grumbling at the stranger's supposed greed, the little girl looked away and was lost in her thoughts for a moment before coming to her senses and turning around. What she saw was a real shock. The brunette's pink eyes widened in horror, as if a huge, scary monster had suddenly appeared in front of her face. From her point of view, it really was the worst nightmare possible. But it was not a fanged, clawed beast, but simply a cold, disgusted look. Moreover, it did not belong to some random servant, but to the doctor himself. At that moment, he looked like a man forced to treat a creature he hated. The girl froze, as if turned into a pillar of salt. She was so scared that she was afraid to even blink or breathe too often, let alone speak. But after a few seconds, it was over. Turning to Devon, the strange medic replied that his adopted daughter's health was no longer in danger, but she needed careful care. While the adults were settling the formalities, the protagonist continued to feel herds of icy goosebumps running down her spine, and her fingers were shaking violently. She had already met this look. It was no different from the looks she had received from her mentors and many of her classmates at the temple. The same icy disdain, as if Esther were some kind of huge, disgusting piece of feces in the eyes of the beholder. This time, she simply could not understand why this was happening to her, because the main character had definitely never met this doctor before. But she turned to her father out loud with another request for forgiveness for the inconvenience caused. Sitting down on the bed, the man tried to explain to the suspicious little girl that illness is not a reason to be ashamed, so it is not and cannot be her or anyone else's fault for what happened. He didn't know what kind of rules were in place in that stupid temple, but in his own home, Devon was ready to call a medic at the slightest suspicion of trouble, at least to make sure that his loved ones were in good health. At the end of this speech, the elder Teresia smiled kindly, looking straight into Esther's eyes, and repeated to her for the last time that there was no reason to reproach herself. Everything was absolutely normal. The main character's lips trembled, and her eyes filled with tears. It was clear that only pride did not prevent her from bursting into tears from an excess of emotions right then. But on the other hand, It helped her get rid of the negative emotions gnawing at her brain. For this alone, the protagonist was so grateful to her adoptive father that it is difficult to express in words. For a while, they both just sat in silence, Devon stroking his daughter's head, while she gathered her courage to finally thank the good Duke for such kindness. She mentally noted that she was ready to cry from gratitude. For a person who had been hated or despised all his life, this was more precious than any material treasure. Meanwhile, a thunderstorm was starting outside the window. And what a thunderstorm it was! One might think that the heavenly thunder spirits had agreed to give mortals such a flood as they had never seen before, taking revenge for all those days when the weather was clear. Drops of water hit the window panes and rooftops like giant acorns, and Devon, watching the storm from the warm, safe confines of his office, thought with hope that the children would be okay. If it weren't for the damned job, which unfortunately could not be refused, the Duke would have rushed to check them without hesitation. And Ben Teresia, watching his boss and relative from the side, noted with a bitter smile to himself how kind he was despite his reputation. Out loud, however, the secretary only allowed himself to agree with the fact that yes, they had not seen such a terrible downpour as today for a very long time. The protagonist gave a vague chuckle at this remark, and then went back to thinking about Esther, noting that the girl had looked nervous in the temple. Then someone burst into the office noisily, without warning or respect. Devon, who had already turned to Ben about his daughter, immediately interrupted, and both men turned to the unexpected visitor. It was not some robber who had suddenly decided to profit from the wealth of the nobility, but only Dorothy. But real panic reigned on the usually cheerful face of the blonde, and the reason for this was Esther. With her last strength, the maid shouted that the young lady had suddenly become ill, and the main character, forgetting about everything in the world, covered the enormous distance from his office to his daughter's chambers in a matter of seconds. The man swung the doors open, nearly knocking them off their hinges to make sure the baby was okay, but saw her curled up in a ball on the floor, trembling all over, wrapped in a blanket. It looked so strange that it clearly frightened even the commander, who had seen a lot, and he very quietly entered the room and called his adopted daughter by name. The girl responded by addressing him in a very creepy voice, officially calling him His Highness, and then turned around, and her look was even more terrible than her tone. Feeling a whole hail of cold ice-like sweat running down his back, Devon tried to take control of the situation and calmly find out what had happened, but he was not allowed to finish. This time, Esther interrupted her father, calling him by his title. Bowing her head and back in a humiliating bow, the main character, in the same supernatural, despairing voice, asked Teresia Sr. to finally kill her. Life for her again became an endless torture, and the girl was ready to do anything to finally make it stop, no matter what the cost. And the man listened to all this with horror. Tears flowed from the protagonist's pink-red eyes in whole clusters, but the girl's voice hardly trembled when she asked her adoptive parent for the last time to give her a quick and painless death. After this, readers were shown how a huge network of white-blue lightning strikes the calm of the temple, as if the deities were angry with the priests for their hypocritical behavior and corruption, and decided to completely wipe them off the face of the earth. The woman standing in the room with the large window repeated the Duke's words and thoughts about it pouring outside. Her face was not shown yet, but one could see her familiar long yellow hair. Yes, it was Rafian. She sang in her honeyed voice, addressing Dina, that when the weather outside was like this, she was in a very bad mood, and this meant the following. The blonde was going to relax. That is, to once again subject the unfortunate protagonist to terrible and humiliating torture, taking revenge for all the failures of the last few days. The main character at such moments could not defend herself or even just run away. She was kept carefully tied hand and foot, so the girl could only wait in horror for the nightmare to begin. This had happened so many times in the past that now, when a strong thunderstorm began again, the brunette immediately forgot that she was now Esther Teresia, the Duke's adopted daughter. It was as if she again found herself powerless and useless. Dinas. The panic attack was so strong that the little girl was in silent hysterics. She was shaking all over, muttering endless apologies, and tears were pouring out of her wide-open eyes in an endless stream. To bring his adopted daughter out of this nightmarish state, Devon had to scream her name at the top of his lungs and even roughly grab the girl by the shoulders. But only this was able to help. The protagonist finally emerged from the whirlpool of terrible memories and realized that right here and now, she was communicating with her adoptive parent and not Rafian. Having made sure that the worst of the attack was behind him, the man took a breather, but did not stop there. He began to ask the brunette in the calmest possible tone questions about whether she realized where she was. However, answering this essentially simple question was much more difficult for her than it might have seemed. Breathing heavily and slowly, shifting her gaze, the heroine asked whether she was in the temple. The Archduke's gaze clearly showed what a strong blow these words had been for him, but out loud, he only answered that, no, it was not a church, but his estate. When it really dawned on Esther that she was safe and that a crazy blonde with knives and tongs wouldn't jump out of the closet, she started shaking again. The girl began to cry and beg for forgiveness and tried to vaguely explain that it was all Rafian's fault. But then it dawned on her that she had started sharing information with her new relative that she didn't want to tell a single living soul, and she immediately shut up. The man tried once again to remind her that his ward was completely safe and that what she had seen was simply a nightmare. But of course, he did not miss the mention of a woman's name beginning with the letter and this made the aristocrat once again ask himself the question, what the hell is going on in the temple, which just for a second is supposed to be an example and a home for all possible benefactors? First, the desperate pleas of the former Dina for death and the panic fear of returning to the hands of good priests. Now this panic attack. Even a complete fool would have long ago realized that something was fundamentally rotten in the church, but Devon didn't say any of this out loud. It wasn't the time or place for that. The man just picked up the girl in his arms like a baby doll and promised to be with her until the storm passed. The heroine tried to remind her that the Duke had a lot of important work to do, but the commander simply replied that he would do it here, after which he gently laid the girl on the bed. Covering her with a blanket and looking her straight in the eyes, the protagonist finally asked the question that should have been asked a long time ago. Did someone bully the brunette in the temple? Unfortunately, Esther lied. Like many victims of abuse, she felt incredible shame and fear when talking or thinking about her tragedy, so she chose to remain silent. It was clear from the Archduke's face that he understood this perfectly well, but it was useless to force an answer out of her, so he only asked when the little girl began to experience a wild fear of thunder. Feeling cornered, the girl desperately tried to lie, that it had simply started a long time ago, but the man did not punish her for it. On the contrary, he stroked her face. Looking her in the eyes, from the height of his considerable height, Teresia Sr. reminded her that although he might not know what was going on in the temple, there would be no abuse or bullying in his home. Therefore, Dina's ex has no reason to be afraid. The new adoptive father himself will not hurt her, and will not allow anyone to do so, at least without serious punishment in return. Then a very sleepy boy's voice was heard, asking what his father was doing here. And Devon looked with some surprise at Judy, who appeared on the threshold. One of the twins looked like he was ready to fall asleep on the go, even hugging a pillow. And when asked why he was not in bed, the boy replied that he wanted to check on his sister. The commander looked on indifferently, as one of his own blood-bred offspring walked towards Esther's bed. Apparently, even he was surprised at how quickly this little hooligan had become attached to his new relative. Seeing that the protagonist's already scarlet eyes had become even redder, the teenager came to the logical conclusion that she had been crying, so he decided to sleep next to her for a peaceful sleep. The father looked at this with a smile. He was clearly proud that at least one of his sons, with all his shortcomings, had so much nobility and gallantry. Moreover, the general added, as if by chance, that it would be very good if Judy came to her sister's bedroom when such thunderstorms raged outside. But even this was not enough for the main character, so she asked as if by chance whether the Grand Duke was going to leave when both children were fast asleep. Another man might have been able to answer coldly and harshly, "No, I have a lot of work ahead of me, and you are no longer a baby to be terrified by flashes of lightning." But Teresia Sr. could not. He calmly promised that he would not leave the room today, but would stay with the children until... And after that, the little ones finally began to fall asleep, forgetting their worries. For several minutes, Devon watched as they sank deeper into slumber, and it was hard to tell what thoughts were running through the man's gray-haired head at that moment. After some time, the door to the chambers opened slightly, and Ben looked in, holding a dim lantern. The secretary wanted to make sure that everything was okay with the children. The protagonist shared his suspicions about abuse in the temple with his assistant, and the brown-haired man was genuinely surprised because he couldn't find anything like that when he was collecting information the first time. But the Archduke only ordered to dig deeper, and he was especially interested in a person named Raphael. The young spy master paused to think. The word sounded suspiciously similar, as if he had heard it once before, until he finally remembered that it was the name of a certain duke's daughter. But the commander replied indifferently that it made no difference whose daughter she was, a simple plowman or the emperor himself, because if she had ever offended Esther. After a dramatic pause, the protagonist finally finished his sentence. He swore that any offender or enemy of his adopted daughter would pay dearly for their sins. The next day, the palace and its surroundings looked as if nothing had happened. There had been no thunderstorm of divine proportions during the night, not to mention the girl's terrible panic attack. On the contrary, plants were blooming everywhere, birds were singing softly, and the sun was sending its warmth from the sky. And in such an idealistic environment, the main character began to wake up. For the first few seconds, she realized that something was wrong, but she couldn't figure out what it was. And then it suddenly dawned on the little girl that Judy and Devon were sleeping on either side of her. To say that the main character was horrified would be an understatement. She blushed like a huge tomato and rushed about, unable to figure out where to put herself from terrible embarrassment. But then she calmed down and thought that all this really did resemble a real family. And because of this, an invisible warmth seemed to spread through her soul again. After this, the action moved sometime into the future. The main character slowly walked along the corridor, while the servants worked hard in the kitchen bedrooms and other rooms. The brunette slowly thought about the fact that after waking up, her father and brother did not say anything about what happened during the night, obviously out of fear of provoking hysteria and panic again. The protagonist was rather grateful to them for this, because it was terribly difficult for her to share such things. But then her attention was drawn to the second twin, Teresia. Danny was sitting in a large, soft chair and reading some book when the main character suddenly entered his room. She said hello, and the boy greeted her dryly in return. The former orphan noted that the Archduke's second son was always reading something, but the young man responded in the same indifferent tone that books are food for the mind, and knowledge is power. After that, he asked what Esther herself was doing, and she, feeling terribly awkward, eventually blurted out that nothing special, just wandering around. Then the boy looked at her for a few seconds with the same cold and detached gaze, and then did something surprising. He offered to go for a walk with him, arguing that it was boring to be alone. Naturally, the girl did not refuse the opportunity to establish a relationship with this last relative of hers, although the offer surprised her, and both children walked out into the street. Even though there seemed to be no danger, the protagonist still began to worry, because Danny promised a walk in the garden, but in fact took her somewhere completely different. For most of the journey, the bespectacled man remained silent, but at some point, to the brunette's even greater surprise, he declared that he had to apologize to her for something. As it turned out, by this, the young duke meant a lie. From the very beginning, he did not intend to take his adopted sister into the garden, but simply took her away from the omnipresent eyes of the maids. Esther felt icy sweat running down her cheek, and her back felt like it was being enveloped by invisible but disgusting tentacles. She only had enough courage to ask what this was all for. The boy, continuing to look at the protagonist indifferently, calmly explained that his twin brother Judy was a real simpleton, so he immediately accepted the orphan as if he had known her all his life. But with Danny, everything was different, and he was not yet going to consider the brunette his relative. And at that moment, he looked at her for the first time, with barely noticeable but still hostility. The girl stared at him, her mouth slightly open in surprise. She simply had no idea what she needed or could say in response to such a statement, and the boy, after a short pause, finished his thought. He intends to find out as much as possible about Esther, in order to know exactly what kind of person she is and how he should treat her. Then the readers are shown a dark, stormy night again. Then the palace of the Teresian family seems like a huge lighthouse surrounded by a colossal, stormy ocean. Few people could sleep that night. The wind beat against the walls with all its available power, and raindrops like arrows tried to break through the window panes, forcing people to toss and turn sleeplessly. Young Danny was no exception. Then, in just a nightgown and warm house slippers, he too sat in a large, comfortable chair and read a thick tome under the light of a lantern. At some point, his eyelids began to rapidly become heavy, as if a lead monolith had been tied to each of them, and the young man realized that he couldn't sit here any longer. It was time to go to bed. But then the teenager saw something that made him instantly forget about sleepiness and open his eyes wide, because he saw his desperately yawning twin walking down the corridor in a nightgown and with a pillow. Judy himself didn't notice his sibling. He was too tired and sleepy for that, but Danny naturally immediately went to find out where his brother had gone at nightfall. As it turned out, it really was the previous night, and the bespectacled man watched and listened from the side as his brother and father calmed Esther down after the seizure that had occurred. The young man did not give himself away in any way, and no one noticed him, but he listened carefully to every word and analyzed it like an experienced researcher observing bacteria. Although from the outside, the teenager looked like the embodiment of cold-bloodedness in reality, he was surprised. Not only did the father agree to sleep in the same room with his adopted daughter, but Judy also joined them, and the young man simply could not understand why. What was so special about this Esther that those around her after a few minutes of conversation were ready to cherish and pamper her as if she were the most precious treasure possible? When the happy family finally fell asleep, Danny silently tore himself away from the wall and went to his room pondering what had happened as if it were a mathematical riddle. He had no doubt that the main character was smart enough, but everything else was shrouded in mystery for him. But this only fueled his curiosity even more. After this brief flashback, readers are brought back to the present moment and are shown a close-up of a huge hole at the base of the palace wall. The children stared at her, Danny calmly and indifferently, but he looked at almost everyone like that, and Esther with languid and surprised eyes. But she also often looked at those around her like that. Eventually, she asked him directly what it was, and the teenager, with mild surprise, explained that it was a dog hole, through which dogs entered and returned from the estate. But the main character, in fact, didn't care. She was only concerned about the fact that Danny allegedly didn't see her as a little sister, but for some reason continued to communicate with her, and even showed her all sorts of secrets. For a moment, the girl even thought that the young Duke was going to drive her out of the palace and through the hole, because in the eyes of the boy, she was like a dog. But in reality, of course, this was not the case. Instead, the bespectacled man himself dropped to his knees and ordered his companion to climb out with him. And this was so unexpected that for a while, Esther literally fell into a stupor. Having realized this, the young man nevertheless deigned to stoop to an explanation. He had some business in the neighboring village, and if they left through this crack, the servants would not notice the absence of the young masters. However, the brunette emphasized that for some reason, her adopted brother wanted to take her with him. And then Danny calmly replied that his sister could stay at home if she didn't want anything else. Naturally, the main character did not refuse. However, squeezing through the hole turned out to be very difficult, even for her with her very thin body from malnutrition. But Devon's offspring characteristically coped with this task much faster and waited patiently outside for some time, even though he was a little larger and looked like a stereotypical nerd. When the protagonist finally got out and stood up with difficulty, the young man noted with barely noticeable surprise that she had gotten out, and Esther incomprehensibly reminded him that it was his idea. In response, Danny again silently stared at his companion, and his gaze expressed absolutely nothing. Even many portraits have more emotional and eloquent eyes. The main character, for her part, looked at the boy in exactly the same way. Her gaze could remind those around her of a hungry cat that desperately wants to get at least a drop of water. This exchange of glances between the children continued for some time. And then the young aristocrat, to the surprise of the brunette, for the first time in history, hid his eyes from someone raising his face higher. The young man finally admitted that yes, Esther was right, and it was he who had offered her a secret path through the wall. But it was still time for them to go. He didn't want to waste any more time. After this, the action moves to a village fair. There was a festive and cheerful atmosphere in the air. There were people everywhere discussing some of their affairs, or just having fun. Here and there, one could notice not only local peasants, but also more interesting personalities. Ladies in expensive high-born suits, warriors, and rangers in armor. Overall, the carnival gave the impression of some strange creature with many bodies. Each of its parts was doing something of its own, which created chaos, but there was a special harmony in it. The protagonist stared at this with wide eyes, unable to believe what she saw. She had most likely never seen so many happy people in one place before. At the same time, Danny seemed much more indifferent to the surroundings. He, of course, had the opportunity to experience such celebrations before, and he, of course, did not weaken his attention for a moment. Looking at the back of the main character, the young man remembered that his father had met her in the temple, and now he was trying to understand what attracted the brown-haired woman to the Grand Duke. The children walked along the busy, crowded street for some time, each absorbed in his own thoughts, until the boy eventually stopped. He innocently stated that he had just remembered that he absolutely had to visit one more place, and Esther, of course, first of all offered to accompany him. In response, the teenager mercilessly refused, saying that it was better to do it alone, and even waved at the brunette like the owner would wave at a very annoying cat that even climbed into the toilet after him. Instead, young Teresia quickly pointed his finger at a certain spot in the very center of the bazaar and suggested that the main character wait there for his return. The protagonist may have wanted to argue deep down, but she lacked the strength and motivation to do so, so she ultimately meekly agreed. She only asked whether he would have to stay alone, but the teenager only asked in confusion what was wrong. He would be back very soon. No one would have time to blink. Esther, after everything she had been through, was in desperate need of constant attention and was afraid to be left completely alone, even for a short time. But this time, she still agreed. After hearing her consent, Danny, as always, nodded with an indifferent look and said goodbye, as if he was going to leave not for a couple of minutes, but forever abandoning the annoying burden. It would seem that it would be very difficult for a fragile teenage boy to move around in a crowd of hurried, clumsy adults, but the little Duke easily dodged between them like a dancer, and the main character looked after him for a very long time, as if a single blink could cause loss and complete loneliness. Meanwhile, the common people at the bazaar continued to go about their business, unaffected by the intrigues and dramas of those in power, and they calmly carried out their work until another crimson-orange sunset arrived. And the protagonist remained in one place throughout all these hours, looking into the distance with the same cat-like pleading gaze, although deep down she began to understand that something was not right here. When some more time passed, the sky became even darker and people began to go home. The main character was forced to admit to herself Danny deceived her in order to leave her. But deep down, the girl suspected from the very beginning that something was wrong with this matter. The young man with whom she had not really communicated before suddenly approached her and offered to go for a walk. Another person would most likely have gotten angry, cursed, and then approached the first passerby with a request to show the way to the estate for a reward. But Esther again plunged into suspicious, depressive thoughts. The little girl thought that the whole family had conspired to get rid of her in this way because they were unhappy about something, and she convinced herself that it was okay. She herself had already thought about leaving, and everything would be fine, but the protagonist herself understood perfectly well that this was complete nonsense, and she was not at all indifferent to the time spent in the Teresia estate. Only there, the former Dina, for the first time in all her lives, was able to feel like a normal person and not a frightened, despicable, insane monster. It is unknown what thoughts the brunette would ultimately come to, and what actions she would decide on, because someone's voice was heard nearby, from which she opened her already large eyes in shock. They turned out to be two unknown men dressed in simple peasant clothes, and they asked what such a sweet little girl was doing in such a place, in a tone that even a fool would have realized that danger was imminent. One quick glance was enough for the thugs to guess that in front of them was the daughter of a high-born family who clearly had quite a bit of money since they could afford such fancy and expensive dresses. One of the criminals became concerned about the intervention of the supposed bodyguard, but his partner calmly reminded them that they had been really broke lately, so it was still worth demanding a ransom from these fat cats. Esther understood perfectly well what kind of people these were and what they were capable of, but she didn't care at all. And when the bandits were about to grab her, the little girl herself approached and calmly asked if these gentlemen could finish her off. To say that the criminals were taken aback would be a huge understatement. They were literally stunned by how calmly and seriously this was said, and even took a few steps back. The main character, in the same indifferent tone, explained that there was no point in kidnapping her for money, for one simple reason. The people she had come to love like family had already thrown her out into the street like a damaged object. While the thugs listened to all this with their mouths open, the brunette continued her speech. Putting her hand to her chest, she convinced the men that it would not be possible to sell her into slavery, so it would be better to kill her. It would be much more profitable for all of them. And if for some reason the adults feel uncomfortable, then it's okay. Esther herself is ready to find a suitable knife for them. Just let them pierce her heart or throat with the blade afterwards. It is unknown how long this circus would have continued, and how it would have ended in the end, because the protagonist was interrupted by another familiar voice belonging to the gray-haired boy. In his usual cool voice, Danny explained that the matter he was handling had been indecently drawn out, and now would Esther be so kind as to explain who these gentlemen were? Only after this did the hapless kidnappers finally recover from their shock and laugh loudly. They say that the royal offspring are calmly walking the streets alone, but at the same time, they are behaving somehow strangely, as if their mothers did not scare them. The young man gave them a cold, contemptuous look, in response chuckled sarcastically, and then calmly asked if these blockheads even understood who they were threatening here. One criminal immediately flared up because of the insolence, but the other, more observant, fearfully urged his comrade to take a closer look. That gray hair, as if made of cobwebs, emerald green eyes. Yes, it was the spitting image of Teresia. Both bandits became nervous. They were well aware of Devon's reputation and violent temper, but they were confused by the fact that the protagonist looked completely different. And Danny, meanwhile, hid his sister behind his back and asked, "Well, how much longer will they waste time?" It was quite possible that deep down, the boy was very nervous, because he after all was forced to confront two grown men who could easily break his neck, but the young aristocrat did not show it. He threatened that if the scoundrels touched him with even a finger, they would bitterly regret it. And the thugs fortunately chickened out, preferring not to mess with these children, because no money can be more valuable than life. Slowly walking away, in order to preserve at least the remnants of dignity, the men began to loudly discuss, since when the Duke had acquired a daughter, but the fact that they were related was immediately obvious. Their self-conceit was gushing out of every crack. For several minutes, the children stood and watched them until both bandits finally disappeared into the distance. And after that, it was as if invisible but very heavy mountains had fallen from the shoulders of the young nobles. Esther didn't have time to say a word when Danny turned to her. And for the first time in history, this young man showed very strong emotions, namely horror, anxiety, and anger. Besides, for the first time, he wasn't embarrassed to openly raise his voice at someone. Almost tearing his vocal cords, the boy yelled, "What was this little idiot even thinking with what part of her body?" For a while, there was an awkward silence again. The children were again glaring at each other, and no one wanted to give in or explain their behavior. But the main character managed to win this time, too. The boy grimaced in irritation and eventually admitted that yes, he had deliberately left her alone at the fair. But Danny also lied about having some business to do. In fact, the teenager remained nearby all this time and carefully watched his foster sister's every action. The reason for this strange experience was that the boy wanted to see how the protagonist would behave, because the true essence of a person is easiest to see when the latter is sure that he is abandoned by the whole world. A hot-tempered person, having learned about this, would probably have gotten into a fight, and even a more reserved person would hardly have been able to resist the opportunity to say a few strong words to the gray-haired smart guy. But the brunette only said, "I see." It wasn't a show for the crowd like Danny's. The girl really didn't feel angry, because she was very happy that her newfound relatives hadn't abandoned her. From this, the little girl felt how her limbs became very, very light, and her body itself seemed to turn into a balloon. And then she was finished off by the words, "I definitely don't wish you harm." They belonged, of course, to the young man. And while he was explaining himself, he felt with slight fear how strange, if not abnormal, everything that was happening was. Naturally, the story was about how the protagonist begged the criminals to kill her and was even willing to help them do it. And Danny may have seemed like an insensitive iceberg, but even for him, it was a nightmare. It was very painful and unpleasant for him to feel that someone hated their own life to such an extent. But out loud, the boy only asked for forgiveness for this test, and gave his word not to do it again. After this, the young man needed a considerable amount of mental effort to at least outwardly cope with these experiences. But he still did it, and then calmly continued to speak. Looking straight into Esther's ruby eyes, the boy admitted that he didn't really want to do this. But what was more important was that the brunette had to stop throwing herself at the feet of those around her once and for all, so that they would finish her off. For a moment, the former Dina began to resemble a mechanism that had suddenly run out of energy, because in response to these words, decades of abuse from Raffian flashed before her eyes. The young man, unaware of the storm that was currently playing in the soul of his adopted sister, asked the latter to learn to value her own life. And these words made the brunette feel very strange. For almost her entire conscious existence, those around her either simply wiped their feet on her or claimed that the mere fact of being an orphan was a disgusting sin before God. And now someone is saying the exact opposite. Finally, Danny cleared his throat quietly, because his throat was sore from screaming, and extended his hand to Esther, reminding her that her family needed her, so it was better to get home soon. And only after this did the protagonist finally regain her gift of speech. Stuttering, she reminded the gray-haired teenager that he did not consider her a sister, and the bespectacled man looking down admitted that he was now ready to take those words back. And returning again to the main character and her unhealthy inclinations, the young aristocrat repeated his request. Stop looking for ways to harm yourself. You need to learn to value your own existence. For a few moments, the brunette simply looked at her brother, with her eyes wide open in surprise, and then looked away, trying to hide her blush and gentle smile. She briefly promised her adoptive relative that she would do what he asked, and after that, both children holding hands slowly went home, as if no shocks had happened that day. There is a quick change of scene, and readers see the palace of the Teresian family the next day, when the sun has again begun to play with its rays between the window panes and the green leaves in the garden. The hosts of this luxury were having breakfast as usual, and Devon himself was sitting at the head of the table. At first, nothing foreshadowed anything strange, but then the Archduke suddenly addressed one of his sons by name. He called out to Danny, who immediately tensed, feeling a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. It didn't take great wisdom to guess what was coming next. The commander did not raise his voice, and did not even look at his guilty offspring. He generally pretended that nothing terrible had happened, but he still asked if the boy would like to explain his behavior yesterday. Esther, who was also present in the dining room, also tensed up, but her intervention was not needed. Guiltily lowering his gaze, the young man admitted that he had acted ugly and stupidly, and he apologized for it. The Archduke, if he had been angry before, now smiled good-naturedly, wiping the remains of food from his lips with a napkin. He appreciated the fact that his son had the courage to simply admit his mistake, instead of denying it. But then the man became more serious, and reminded his sons that, yes, the boys can be partly understood, because it is impossible to become attached to a person and get to know them completely in just a few days. But the main character is still part of their family. Judy blinked in confusion, glancing from his quiet brother to his father, who was reading the speech. Clearly no one had told him anything, and now the boy didn't understand what was going on at all. Now that all the dots had been placed over the right places, the governor was about to return to the meal again. But at the last second, he remembered one more thing, now addressing everyone present, and not just Esther or the twins. The great aristocrat said that he wanted to know their opinion, without specifying what exactly. For some time, the kids patiently waited for the continuation, but it did not follow. The atmosphere in the room became more tense, and when the boys or the girl had already decided to ask directly what it was about, Devon finally admitted. The brother's birthday was approaching. Accordingly, the Grand Duke wanted to know what kind of party his children wanted to have. And Judy, literally glowing with enthusiasm, was the first to suggest the idea of holding a masquerade ball where people could have fun guessing who was hiding behind the mask. But his brother was of the exact opposite opinion. Danny thought such things were deadly boring, but what he would definitely like was to hold a literary discussion where those present could easily broaden their horizons. And only the protagonist remained silent. She looked at the men with the gaze of a dead fish, because in principle she did not understand what kind of thing a birthday was and how best to spend it. Devon Teresia, as in previous times, easily noticed how confused his adopted daughter was, and smiled encouragingly at her, thereby demonstrating that she should not be afraid to show her thoughts to others. After this, the Archduke calmly said, interrupting a heated argument between the twins, that this year he had planned something very special for them, unlike anything that had happened before. The brothers instantly forgot about their quarrel and spoke entirely out loud. Imagination and anticipation painted absolutely fantastic pictures in their heads, and the military leader, after another pause, finished his speech. As it turned out, the promised surprise wasn't some kind of material gift. It wasn't even related to Judy and Danny themselves. Instead, their father was going to dedicate the celebration to Esther, using it as a way to introduce the little girl to high society. The boys, however, not only were not offended, but on the contrary, they supported this idea with sincere enthusiasm. And although the brunette herself was very embarrassed, they quickly explained to her that such parties are best suited for the debut of new faces. One of the teenagers had already imagined what a sensation this would be among the local kids, and that idiot Sebastian would definitely get into trouble, but Devon angrily asked not to use the heroine as an argument in some dispute. The boy replied no less grumpily that he hadn't meant anything like that, starting another small family squabble, while the protagonist herself was wondering what she should do. As it turned out, despite the promise she made to Danny, Esther had learned nothing. She was still going to quietly slip out of the palace and then look for a thug who would agree to send her to her forefathers. But the Grand Duke, as if anticipating her mood, called out to the girl and good-naturedly declared that there were still 3 whole months until the holiday, and until that moment he would teach his newfound daughter everything she would need to know, first and foremost etiquette. Then the man turned around, and with the honeyed smile possible, declared that he had very high hopes that the twins' birthday would remain in the heroine's memory as an exclusively positive one. The protagonist stared at her father's face, with her mouth slightly open in shock, and it was understandable because even the atmosphere itself seemed to have changed, becoming sunnier and more relaxed. Eventually, the girl managed to overcome another attack of incredible embarrassment and barely audibly replied that she would be very grateful to the Archduke for these services. After that, there was a short time skip. Breakfast was over. The children had wandered off in all directions. Devon, with the help of a maid, was taking off his uncomfortable, expensive suit, and his secretary reported that he had found suitable teachers for Esther. Ben, turning over one sheet of paper after another, noted that he had found the best specialists in their field graduates of the academy itself. However, these big shots also refused to accept more than one student per year. The main character, however, was not particularly impressed by this. He only indifferently asked if it was true, and the brown-haired man confirmed that yes, these teachers were now completely focused on the daughter of some count. In response, the protagonist calmly stated that he was ready to offer these scientists and sages 3 times the salary because he wanted to get the best education for his children. After all, his position obliged him. The secretary, of course, did not dispute the ruler's decision, but he was surprised to himself at how madly he loved his adopted daughter, because he was not ready to spend so much even on his own sons. Perhaps in a different situation, Ben would have finally asked a direct question about why the usually steadfast and cold-blooded commander had become so attached to this orphan that he was literally ready to get the moon from the sky for her. But now was not the time for that. Instead, the spy master reported that he had finally conducted an in-depth investigation, and the main character immediately tensed up like a tiger, ready to make a deadly leap towards an unsuspecting antelope. Going through numerous documents, the brown-haired man explained that not a single source confirmed that corporal punishment was carried out on children in the temple. Officially, nothing of the sort was happening. On paper, the temple looked like an innocent abode of kindness and mercy, where all candidates for the title of saint had equal rights and opportunities, and the slightest signs of bullying would be immediately noticed and stopped by the abbess. Dev and Teresia listened to Ben's report with all possible attention. Perhaps from the outside, it might seem that the Archduke did not appreciate the efforts of his relative and secretary, but in fact, this was not at all the case. When the brown-haired man finished speaking, the aristocrat was silent for a while, thinking about what was said, and comparing it with what he knew before asking another short question. Was this all the information? But even in this, the man did not disappoint his boss. Having taken out another sheet of data, the younger Teresia noted that he had carefully combed through the composition of the students and ultimately found this mysterious Raytheon. True, the latter was not a particularly difficult task, because Ben admitted that there was only one woman with that name in the entire temple, and Devon immediately understood what this could mean. The main character didn't even have time to express his guess out loud, because the secretary understood him from the very first word. After reading the document, he confirmed that the bloodthirsty blonde was the daughter of Duke Braun. The dukes were the highest-ranking aristocrats in the feudal countries, their power second only to that of the supreme ruler, meaning that there was a much more powerful force behind the Raytheons than might appear. Devon, realizing what kind of enemy he was dealing with, even asked again if Ben was sure that there was no mistake in this information, and the brown-haired man confirmed that there was not. Moreover, he found out that from the first day, this fair-haired girl was actively prepared for the status of the new head of the church. In other words, even if the antagonist is creating one nightmare after another under the temple vaults, it will be extremely difficult to find out, because she will be covered by both high-ranking priests and blood relatives. Obtaining more or less effective incriminating evidence in such conditions is incredibly difficult, even for a man with the power and position of an archduke. And Devon himself understood this perfectly well. The man sat in thought for a long time, pondering what course of action would be best to take next, before finally asking Ben to repeat the investigation. Perhaps they would have a little more luck next time. When the secretary left, the protagonist slowly rose from his chair and turned to the window, which offered a magnificent view of the palace garden. Looking at the flowering trees, the commander thought that, officially, the temple really did appear to be a peaceful and prosperous abode. But at the same time, he remembered the panic attacks he had seen in Esther before. How she had tearfully begged him to cut the thread of her life, but not return it to the priests, or how she had been hysterical during a thunderstorm mentioning the name Raphael. Devon Teresia frowned slightly, and finally mentally asked his adopted daughter a question. What exactly happened to her during her existence under the care of the church that her psyche was so crippled? After some time, the audience is shown the little brown-haired girl again. Her hair was braided into spirals, and she was looking very intently at what she was holding in her hands, namely a piece of paper and a pink marker. As it turned out, at some point, she was given a drawing kit and left to have fun. And the girl thought with incredible delight how cool it was to do whatever she wanted as much as her heart desired. The Grand Duke wanted his adopted daughter to have the best of everything, so he even ordered the highest quality and most expensive paper to be issued, not at all like the mother superiors in the temple did. During those dark years, Esther wasn't just given bad things to do as a hobby. She was shamed for wanting to draw, as if it were some kind of deeply shameful and disgusting activity that was disgusting to even mention in polite society. In another situation, the protagonist would have fallen into depression again, would have started to feel sorry for herself, and quietly cry until a kind soul was found who would console her. But this time, everything turned out differently. The main character was so happy that she could now do what she always wanted to do that she didn't even want to be sad. She felt too good for any unpleasant memories to ruin it. For some time, the girl carelessly moved the markers over the sheet of paper, drawing certain contours and filling them with colors, until finally she picked up the drawing and looked at it with an inquisitive gaze, exactly like an experienced artist looking at the results of his work. In the end, the brunette found the next picture satisfactory and thought hard about what to depict next. And Dorothy watched this with a touching smile, just like an older sister looking after her younger sister. For a while, the woman watched in silence as the young lady continued to pursue her hobby. But eventually, she had to intervene and quietly call out to the little girl. The blonde probably wanted to remind him that she had classes to attend. But then she looked at the piece of paper and grabbed it with fingers trembling with excitement, lamenting that this was simply unbelievable. Luckily, it wasn't because the maid was scared or angry. On the contrary, she was delighted to see how Esther had drawn her, and in such an incredibly detailed and realistic way. It was almost a full-fledged picture, one that could easily have been painted by an adult, an accomplished artist, and the protagonist, in addition, carelessly clarified that it was a gift to the maid for all the help she gives her. Dorothy almost melted with emotion and delight. Not only was her mistress incredibly kind and beautiful for her age, but she was also talented like no one else, and the blonde immediately offered to tell Duke Devon about this wonderful discovery. But this did not cause a happy reaction from the former orphan. On the contrary, the little girl was frightened, desperately, waved her hands, and asked not to tell His Highness anything, because this was not a trifle worth attention. The reason again lay in the complexes acquired during her stay in the temple. The other girls already did not like Dina because of her origin, and when they found out that she was a first-class artist, they began to humiliate her even more, saying that such a trifle was within anyone's reach. A more mature and seasoned person would have immediately understood that they were saying this out of envy of the protagonist's talents, trying to compensate for their own wounded pride. But the naive little girl took these words to heart and at face value. Fortunately, those dark days were a thing of the past. Now there was a person nearby who could appreciate the talents of the main character and honestly admitted that it was something magnificent. As Dorothy continued to look at the picture, she practically squealed with delight. She could not believe that something like this could be created by a 12-year-old girl, and Esther eventually felt a mixture of pride and embarrassment. And then Danny Teresia appeared on the stage in a small green and yellow tailcoat, and with a book under his arm. The teenager grumpily asked what had happened because he had heard the blonde's screams even from the other end of the corridor. The protagonist was so surprised that she even shouted out her adopted brother's name, and he stared at her with his signature unreadable gaze as if he were a small robot and not a living child. But in the end, the young man sat down next to the brunette, looked deeply into her eyes, and said that she already called Judy her brother, so let her award him the same title. It was really offensive. They were after all related, but Esther treated him as if they were strangers, and the girl was very embarrassed by this. She didn't think that Danny could be offended by such a trifle. The protagonist thought hard. Another person in her place would have laughed in the young man's face and would have remembered that rude test at the village fair, but the girl was not like that at all. So she finally made the most appropriate decision. She made a very languid face, as if she was about to cry, and in the most touching voice possible, she said, "Little brother Danny." Oddly enough, it had an effect on the teenager, and how he suddenly turned red like a tomato, and even his eyes, it seemed, showed signs of moisture. But the young duke was able to quickly overcome his embarrassment. He quickly thanked her for this, and asked her to continue in the same spirit, and then casually clarified that the protagonist likes to read. He would be happy to help her find a book to her taste. Only after this did the boy notice that his adopted relative was doing something with sheets of expensive paper and multicolored felt-tip pens. Had she really taken up drawing? Having received an affirmative answer, the young man in glasses, in order to keep the conversation going, noted that Esther must really like doing this kind of thing, and the main character agreed without any problems. The young man chuckled vaguely and looked intently at his sister again. It seemed as if an extremely complex computational process was taking place in his head, like in a small computer. But in the end, Danny sat down next to the protagonist again and asked her directly if she could, for example, draw him, or if it was too difficult. And the brunette, slightly frightened, began to babble that she didn't draw very well. Then Dorothy, forgotten by the young aristocrats, intervened in the conversation. Still unable to remove the touching smile from her face, the blonde declared that the young lady was an amazing artist, and she should be ashamed to doubt her skill. The gray-haired teenager looked at her thoughtfully, thought about something again, and then turned back to the main character and repeated his question. So would she be able to paint a portrait or not? The protagonist was very embarrassed and made an indefinite moan. She felt very awkward, not only because two people at once suddenly began to take an interest in her hobby, but also because Danny was sitting very close. Unable to give a direct refusal, but also not wanting to upset her adopted brother, the girl eventually plucked up her courage and promised to paint his own portrait. After that, there was a small time skip during which the kids moved from the corridor to a certain room. The boy was now sitting and reading in a large, soft chair, while the little girl was sitting at a nearby table and concentrated on working on a drawing. Knowing that the artist should not be disturbed in any way in order for the result to be good, Danny tried not to move. But in the end, he could not resist and cast a probing glance at the young craftswoman. The young man mentally noted that the brunette had indeed approached her task very responsibly. She looked extremely collected, and even the expression on her face was very different from those that Teresia had seen before. But at some point, something very strange happened. The main character's pink-red eyes suddenly began to glow with a soft yellow glow, as if a goddess had momentarily entered her. The Archduke's son noticed this perfectly well, and he shuddered in fear, after which he stared at the protagonist with all his eyes. You never know what kind of trick she might pull next time, but nothing strange happened this time. The girl continued to draw until she asked why her brother was staring at her with such a wild face, and Danny preferred to avoid answering because he himself no longer knew whether it was an optical illusion. A few seconds later, Esther Teresia announced that the portrait was ready, and the boy was surprised again. The work took her much less time than he expected, but he of course wanted to see the result. Feeling the embarrassment returning and the unpleasant chill running down her spine again, the main character warned that she hadn't practiced for a long time and asked her brother not to expect anything outstanding, simply out of fear that he would be disappointed. The gray-haired teenager took the handed-out piece of paper and stared at it for a very, very long time, so that the protagonist began to get even more nervous until Danny finally spoke again. At first, one might have thought that the young man was truly upset because he began his speech in an emphatically stern and calm tone, but after a second, it became clear that this was not the case. In fact, young Teresia was incredibly delighted and happy. His face was flushed, his eyes were shining as if he was about to cry, and instead of a calm tone, the bespectacled man was almost screaming. He simply could not believe that a small child was capable of creating such gorgeous paintings, not to mention hiding his gift from others. The protagonist felt very awkward about this. It seemed to the girl that anyone could do something like this, and that those around her were simply rudely flattering her, while Danny almost dropped his jaw when he found out that no one even taught the heroine to draw. She mastered everything on her own, not wanting to listen to any more nonsense about, "Oh, it's nothing, what's the big deal?" The teenager simply walked up to his adopted sister and stroked her head like a cat, claiming that such talent deserved attention and recognition. At that moment, he no longer resembled in any way that cold-blooded, aloof, bespectacled man who was ready to leave his adopted sister alone for many hours. On the contrary, tenderness and love shone in his eyes. Having finished petting the protagonist and complimenting her, the young aristocrat rushed out of the room with the drawing, calling for Gilbert the butler, who looked after the twins in the same way Dorothy looked after Esther's. And the young brunette stood there for a long time, trying to grasp the idea that it turns out, was not an empty space. On the contrary, she really was capable of creating some things better than other people, and for this, she could receive praise. And this made the ex-Dina eventually realize that this is not enough. She wants those around her to continue to praise her, tell her how smart she is, and comfort her in every possible way. After this, readers are again shown the Archduke's abode from the perspective of a casual observer, and then someone's voice respectfully says, "Here you are, Your Highness." It belonged to the butler, who was just now discussing the issue of training with the main character. Devon, angrily adjusting his clothes, replied that one should never relax. War could come at any moment, and the army in the Austin Empire is now such that it would make chickens laugh. And the worst thing is that you can't trust anyone either. Spies from other kingdoms and empires are hiding everywhere, and no one can be sure who will be a friend and who will be an enemy. Having finished grumbling, the man decided to ask what his adopted daughter was doing, and Gilbert immediately replied that the young lady was in the garden at that moment. At first, the Archduke took this news calmly, because he thought that the protagonist was walking around as usual, but he immediately pricked up his ears when he learned that Esther had taken up drawing. It sounded very unexpected and strange. Devon even asked if it was really about his new daughter, and the butler not only confirmed it, but also added that the brunette's pictures came out beautiful. The main character thoughtfully rubbed his chin. As befits a good parent, he tried to find out in time what his charges were doing. But everything that concerned the little girl was extremely important. The Archduke then wondered where exactly Esther was. And after that, the focus shifted to the magnificent palace garden, where there was an equally luxurious gazebo made of white stone. At first glance, it might seem that this place was uninhabited, and there was nothing here except birds and squirrels jumping between the branches. But then a barely audible soft rustle was heard, and another white leaf fell on the table. The protagonist, as Gilbert said, was drawing. And if before, she looked very embarrassed when someone paid attention to this, ashamed of her interest, now on the contrary, She literally glowed with pleasure and delight. And the Grand Duke, somewhere in the depths of his palace, accompanied by his butler, finally finished his thought. He too would like to receive a gift from his daughter. The Lord's words and deeds were always in line, and very soon readers were shown him wandering through the garden with a dreamy smile in the company of a mustachioed servant. Without the context, it would be easy to think that the man was about to propose to the love of his life, receive an award for his military exploits, or take the imperial throne. His face was almost cracking from the grin. But the reason was much more trivial, although still understandable. Devon Teresia was going to Esther to pamper her once again, and at the same time check how exactly she draws. And at that moment, the girl was very concentratedly moving pencils and markers across the paper. Like many people who are carried away by some hobby, she completely forgot about the world around her. Only outlines and colors existed before her eyes. Because of this, the protagonist did not pay any attention to the fact that her adoptive father was approaching her, despite the fact that the Grand Duke did not particularly hide his presence. The commander paused and watched this for a moment with a smirk, before quietly noting how excellent the brunette's concentration was. And Gelbert mentally noted that the master really was crazy when it came to his adopted daughter. The old servant didn't make a sound, but Devon still turned to him and sternly hissed, as if to say that even if the heavens fell to the earth and another appearance of the goddess occurred, his daughter still couldn't be distracted. Meanwhile, Esther Teresia finished and thought about it. Like many artists having finished painting, she wanted to take up the brush again, but she could not understand what thing would be best to transfer to parchment next. There were no worthy ideas in her mind. Only after this did the girl suddenly feel as if someone was looking at her. She slowly turned around and almost screamed in horror when she suddenly saw her grinning adoptive parent in front of her. Having overcome her fear from surprise, the protagonist slowly asked the Duke how long the latter had been watching her, and the man admitted that it had not been long. Having heard that the heroine had a new hobby, he wanted to take a look at it. Moreover, thanks to loyal informants, the commander already knew perfectly well that the brunette had managed to make several portraits. But he still asked out loud whether it was she who had given Danny his own image. Not understanding what His Highness was getting at and what to expect from this conversation, the girl admitted that yes, that was true, although she thought that her adopted brother's drawing had not turned out very well. But Devon was not convinced. On the contrary, he remarked that the painting was magnificent, and then, with the most intriguing half-smile possible, he asked an innocent question. Would Esther paint him? The main character was truly horrified by this proposal, and the military leader, misinterpreting it, backed down, saying, well, if it's really hard, then it's not necessary, but that turned out not to be the case. The girl still continued to be a little embarrassed by her hobby. When she was alone, it was not scary, but as soon as her adoptive father approached her, her complexes raised their heads again, forcing her to answer. I don't draw very well, no need. Teresia Sr., judging by his condescending smile, guessed this perfectly well, but decided not to use a direct approach. On the contrary, after a few seconds of thought, the Archduke declared that his office was a bit empty and needed a good portrait. Then Devon, with a very innocent and emphatically regretful look, said that, well, if it was difficult for his adopted daughter to do this, then they would have to hire an outside artist, nothing could be done. And the brunette looked at her father as if he had suggested cruelly killing an innocent kitten. And Gelbert, who had been standing at the entrance to the garden gazebo all this time, and had seen and heard everything perfectly, mentally noted how skillfully and shamelessly the gentleman was lying, because every time Teresia had been offered to make a picture of him, before he had indifferently shrugged his shoulders and refused. But the main character, who lived in the palace for a week at most, of course could not know that the commander was putting on a show. In fact, she almost lost consciousness when she imagined how she was decorating her adoptive parents' office with her work. No matter how shy the brunette was, she would never miss the opportunity to make such a gift. And Teresia, perfectly aware of this, simply manipulated her, encouraging her to forget about her shyness and agree to the offer. The man understood perfectly well that the girl had fallen for the bait, but still, just in case, he asked whether she would now create his portrait. And the protagonist agreed, but on the condition that the Archduke himself had no objections. Of course he didn't have any, so the military leader, in order to motivate the young artist, gently stroked her head, and thanked her, as if the painting was already hanging on the wall. Having petted the little girl like a puppy or a cat, Devon assured her that he fully believed in her abilities, as if encouraging her to finally forget about all the complexes and doubts associated with drawings. After this, there was another short time skip. Instead of showing the readers a brunette doing her drawing, the narrator showed the audience Ben Teresia walking along a path in the garden. The secretary and chief informant of the Grand Duke was most likely trying to find his master in order to give him another report, but did not find him in his usual place, and went in search until he ran into Gelbert. The mustachioed butler bowed his head respectfully, greeting his superior servant, and the latter, out of breath from haste and excitement, tried to ask where the Duke had gone since he urgently needed to submit an important report. In response, the elderly gentleman briefly said that the military leader was here and pointed to the gazebo. In it, Esther was busily fiddling with paper sheets, and Devon was watching this with such attention that it seemed that if you hit him on the back of the head, he would not even blink an eye. Gelbert explained to Ben that the young lady was creating an image of her adoptive parent, so the aristocrat, of course, would never move from his place unless his life, or the life of the little artist, depended on it. To say that Ben was stunned would be a significant understatement. In fact, the spymaster nearly lost his jaw, as it was well known that the Grand Duke and military leader hated his portraits. In response, the military leader cast a very angry look at his younger relative and assistant, warning him to shut up immediately because God forbid the protagonist heard the truth. Words cannot describe how upset she would be because of this. Fortunately, the secretary understood this and decided not to go into conflict. He quickly fell silent, and Gelbert, with a good-natured smile, explained that the main character had incredible talent, and she and her adoptive father looked truly happy doing this. The brown-haired man sadly agreed with the butler that this was the case, after which he plunged into thought. Ben noted to himself how strange and unexpected everything that was happening was. He meant naturally Devon Teresia. This character was greatly feared for his brutal methods of warfare. Those around him saw him as almost a monster in human skin. But in the presence of Esther, he behaves incredibly meekly and tenderly, as if he were a completely different person. For some time, the man continued to watch with a trembling smile as his adopted daughter moved brushes, pencils, and markers across the paper, after which he called out to her, forcing her to pause for a moment. When the protagonist focused her attention entirely on her father, the latter asked her if she liked drawing, and upon receiving an affirmative answer, he asked if the brunette would like to study other types of art at the same time. The girl was surprised, not understanding what Devon was getting at, and the commander explained that any path in life was open to his daughter. She could devote herself to whatever her heart desired. And if she wanted to become a professional artist, for example, she could count on her parents' support. After that, the main character was silent for a long time. This idea shook her to the depths of her soul, because just recently, her only path in life was to turn into a toy for Rafian and a walking wineskin with supernatural blood. And the former Dina could not understand how the Archduke could be so kind. It was very difficult, but the protagonist still forced herself to say "thank you" out loud, and the commander answered with a smile, "You're welcome," implying that he was ready to fulfill any wish if only it was expressed. And everything would be fine. But from the thoughts of the former orphan, it became clear that even now, after everything that had happened, she wanted to run away from home to find death. So she ordered herself not to get used to all this warmth and good nature. The former Dina lived with the Teresias for a week at most, a ridiculously short period of time, but she managed to become completely close to them, and this was unexpected even for the brunette herself. But of course, she did not share this out loud. She only warned that she had finished painting the portrait. While handing over the drawing, the main character was even more nervous than the last time when she transferred Danny's face to paper, because this time it was about her adoptive father, and the thought that he might be disappointed was even more frightening. Like the bespectacled teenager, Devon initially showed no particular emotion as he looked at the resulting image. He glanced back and forth, chuckled quietly, while Esther meanwhile almost passed out from anxiety. The atmosphere in the gazebo changed abruptly, from warm and familiar to tense, as if before a thunderstorm. But in the end, The Archduke quietly called Ben, asking the secretary to come closer. The brown-haired man, together with the butler, Gelbert, cautiously approached the gentleman who handed them a piece of paper. And when the informant took a good look at it, he could not help but gasp, as if he had suddenly seen a living deity. Of course, in reality, it was just a portrait of the patriarch of the Teresia family, but Esther made it extremely high quality and accurate. She not only very accurately depicted the appearance of her adoptive parent, but also managed to convey the main features of his character with just the help of his eyes and a slight smile. To say that the servants were astonished to the core would be a gross understatement. Gelbert was so surprised that for the first time in history, he opened his eyes, and the secretary muttered with a slurred voice that the young lady had a great gift. In fact, Ben Teresia added a second later that the drawing was divinely beautiful, not just good, and Devian, without thinking, suggested that this could be a consequence of life in the temple, not noticing how the brunette tensed up at such words. Unfortunately, the man was too pleased and happy to understand that Esther was not very comfortable with such praise. Continuing to look at the portrait, the great aristocrat asked what the butler thought about it, and he of course agreed that the drawing was incomparable. After this, the general remembered that very soon a banquet would be held at his estate for other representatives of the nobility, and this was very opportune. He would have died, but did not miss the opportunity to boast to those around him about the talents of his daughter. Immediately after this, the protagonist asked Gelbert where the expensive frame he won at auction was, and the butler reminded him that Danny had already taken it for himself. The bespectacled young man also received a beautiful portrait from Esther, and he of course did not throw it away. On the contrary, he found the best frame of all that were nearby, and then hung it in the room as a keepsake. Of course, the man did not take the necessary item away from his son. Instead, he ordered the servants to acquire an equally expensive artifact as quickly as possible so that the guests could be truly amazed by what they saw. Having given the most important orders, the great commander again looked tenderly at the drawing and thanked his adopted daughter for creating such a masterpiece. At that moment, it was extremely difficult to recognize in Devon that same aristocrat and military leader who could without hesitation finish off the man who attacked him. Now he was much more reminiscent of a joyful child who finally received the long-awaited toy. Esther looked at his pink, laughing face with genuine surprise, because in her memories, Patriarch Teresia appeared as a much harsher and more severe man. Because of this, she was even ashamed to be in the presence of her adoptive parent now. And the Archduke noticed this. He good-naturedly asked what was wrong now, but the brunette, desperately hiding her gaze, lied that everything was fine. Then the protagonist felt even more awkward, so much so that she had a hard time suppressing the desire to hide her face in her hands or even run away. The heroine herself, deep down, was aware of her incredible shyness, but she couldn't do anything about it. And after some time, the previously mentioned banquet for high-born persons began. The very one at which Devon Teresia was going to solemnly demonstrate to the guests the small masterpiece of his new child taken from the temple. The assembled counts and countesses, barons and baronesses shared their impressions of the arrival with delight and enthusiasm. As it turned out, the Grand Duke had not invited such companies to his place for a very long time, so now everyone was waiting with interest for further developments. However, it would be a lie to say that the local lords had a good relationship with the main character, quite the opposite. The owner of the palace looked at all these social conversations with incredible boredom, while several nobles fawningly praised him for all sorts of achievements and successes. Hearing this, the protagonist grinned maliciously, and then looking straight into the eyes of those gathered, asked if they really considered this success. And an aura of fear seemed to emanate from the commander. The people around him froze in horror, with fake smiles like a pack of rabbits suddenly confronted by a huge bloodthirsty tiger. But no more embarrassment followed. Instead, Devon relaxed and turned to his secretary. Hearing that the required object had already been delivered to the place, the Archduke thanked Ben and then waved his hand and asked those around him for a moment of attention. But the guests were already watching his every gesture with all possible respect. Two servants, groaning with effort, brought into the ballroom a large square and thin object hidden by a white sheet. And the aristocrats began to whisper among themselves what it could be, and they quickly guessed that it was most likely a painting, But this was precisely what was strange. After all, Teresia was not known as a fan of painting. The main character, in order to warm up the audience's interest, deliberately waited for some time, after which he slowly stood up, and with one sharp movement pulled off the covering, demonstrating to those around him his portrait recently painted by Esther. The image was created on simple, albeit expensive white paper, using pale colors and ordinary pencils, but it conveyed the image and character of the military leader so accurately that everyone gasped with delight and began to argue about what kind of genius could have created such a thing. And everything would have been fine, but among those gathered there was one strange man. He was a dark-skinned blonde with golden eyes, and one glance at the painting was enough for him to feel a strange power from it. The stranger immediately guessed that the protagonist created the portrait using holy miracles, and Devon meanwhile addressed the assembled group. He admitted that all the artists they mentioned were masters of their craft, but none of them had anything to do with the painting. It was created by Teresia's daughter. The aristocrats began to whisper among themselves again, trying to understand since when the Archduke had acquired female offspring, so the man quickly explained to them himself. Not long ago, he decided to visit the temple, chose a certain girl there, and adopted her according to all the rules. After this, the military leader added that in the near future, he would hold another reception where he would officially introduce the baby to high society, and all these counts and barons had better come there. And the nobles, again frightened, flatteringly promised to come no matter what. After this, the event continued in the usual manner. Guests sampled drinks and snacks, discussed gossip with each other, and the Grand Duke himself stood alone on the balcony and looked at the night sky, decorated with a bright full moon. After this, the same blonde man in a light suit quietly approached the main character, and the commander, without turning his head, greeted him with the words, "The perfect atmosphere for a heart-to-heart talk, isn't it, Benjamin?" To which the visitor replied, "I'm glad to meet you again, Your Highness." As it turned out, the two men knew each other well. Teresia, turning to his friend, noted with a good-natured smile that he had already stopped hoping for his appearance, and the fair-haired nobleman sheepishly admitted that he was late due to a broken carriage wheel during the journey. Devon responded to this with a quiet, good-natured laugh, after which he admitted that it was Benjamin's optimism that was the factor that helped him get through the many hardships of life at the front. But the blonde modestly replied that this was an exaggeration. Then the protagonist looked closely at his old friend and noted that he looked somewhat gloomy. Perhaps some unpleasantness had occurred. And the guest, after a short hesitation, again addressed the Archduke in an official and respectful manner. Benjamin reminded him that they had known each other for a long time, and although he felt uncomfortable, he was forced to ask the commander for a favor. But the main character only threw up his hands and replied that the blonde was among the few who could be trusted unconditionally, so he could ask for anything. However, the man could not bring himself to just lay out the essence of the matter right away. Looking nervously at Devon, he clarified whether Esther had really painted that portrait alone without any help, and the gray-haired aristocrat confirmed this with bewilderment. Feeling beads of sweat running down his face and goosebumps running down his spine, the blonde-haired man mentally recalled the feeling, as if the painting had been created not by an ordinary little girl, but by a saint capable of performing miracles. Such people wielded the greatest power within the Austin Empire, rivaling even the emperor. In this regard, the church was subordinate to them, and only a true saint could put so much miraculous aura into an ordinary painting. Accordingly, if we imagine that one day this gift will fully awaken in Esther, then the entire Teresian family will gain colossal influence thanks to the status of relatives of the current confidant of the goddess among mortals. But on the other hand, it made one wonder how it could have happened that the temple priests had let go of a candidate with such colossal potential, because it was easier to believe that the sun was cold than that it had happened without any intrigue. Benjamin didn't say any of this out loud, knowing full well that his old friend would hardly be pleased with such conversations. Instead, the blonde finally asked if Mrs. Teresia would be so kind as to paint a portrait of Mr. Noah. The name was familiar to Devon. For some reason, he suddenly flinched and recoiled as if he had been struck, and then, in a disbelieving tone, asked if his friend really continued to care about him. Realizing that this was indeed the case, the protagonist noted the incredible devotion of the blonde, to which the latter modestly replied that he would faithfully serve his master, even if the rest of the world turned away from him. What was so strange about that? As it became known later, Noah was a young but very sick aristocrat. This young man had suffered so much trouble and suffering that many had already sentenced him to a quick death, and Benjamin wanted to get his painting while the boy was still breathing. Archduke Teresia was silent for a long time, carefully weighing all the pros and cons, after which he finally announced that he had to ask the brunette's opinion herself. And the blonde shuddered in shock, clearly not expecting such liberality from his old friend. The commander explained that his adopted daughter's opinion was very important to him, and he would not order her to do something unpleasant. But the real reason was much more serious. Devon himself understood perfectly well that these portraits could pose a danger. After this, the action moves to a completely different part of the palace where the protagonist and Dorothy were. They were both looking at a large, beautiful flower, and the maid gasped, wondering when it had time to bloom, because it was planted a couple of days ago.